Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere so cold that the air itself becomes your enemy the moment you step outside. We are going to Yakutia, a place so far into the frozen heart of Russia that even the maps seem reluctant to linger there. Tonight you are going to survive, at least in your imagination, temperatures that drop to -71 degrees Celsius. A cold so profound that your breath does not just mist in front of your face. It crackles, freezes midair, and falls to the ground in tiny ice crystals with a faint whispered hiss that the locals call the whisper of stars. You probably will not survive this, by the way. Statistically speaking, most people exposed to -71 degrees Celsius without preparation last somewhere between 4 and 7 minutes before things get very, very serious. But tonight, tucked under your blanket, you are perfectly safe, and we are going to take our time exploring what it actually means to live in the coldest inhabited place on Earth. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want to make this a little community moment, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world people are drifting off to sleep. Whether you are in Melbourne at 2 in the morning or in a snowstorm in Minnesota, somehow we are all here together tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in Eastern Russia, in a federal republic so vast it would swallow the entire continental United States and still have room left over for Western Europe to tuck itself into a corner. This is the Sakha Republic, more commonly known as Yakutia, and it covers roughly 3 million square kilometers of boreal forest, tundra, frozen river plains, and mountain ranges that have never once been warm enough to feel smug about it. The Lena River cuts through it like a slow, ancient artery. The taiga, that immense belt of coniferous forest stretching across the top of the world, wraps around the landscape in every direction, dark and dense and indifferent to your presence. You are, in the most literal geographic sense, extremely far from anywhere that sells a decent cup of coffee. The town at the center of tonight's story is Oymyakon. You will want to hold that name gently in your mind, because it is not a town that announces itself loudly. It sits in a valley in the northeastern part of Yakutia, cradled by low mountains that do one very efficient thing: they trap cold air. Cold air, as you may vaguely remember from school physics, is denser than warm air, and so it sinks. In a valley like Oymyakon's, it sinks, pools, settles, and refuses to leave, like a particularly stubborn houseguest who has decided that your couch is their couch now and they have absolutely nowhere else to be. The result is a microclimate so extreme that it holds the official record for the lowest naturally occurring temperature ever recorded in a permanently inhabited settlement on Earth. That record, in case you are curious, sits at -67.7 degrees Celsius, recorded in 1933, though some local accounts and certain temperature readings from the early Soviet era suggest the mercury may have scraped even lower, perhaps to -71.2 degrees Celsius, depending on which thermometer you trust and which Soviet bureaucrat was responsible for writing it down. Historians still argue whether the 1933 measurement was taken under fully standardized conditions or whether the particular placement of the instrument, in a frost hollow with unusual topographic shielding, inflated the reading slightly. It is one of those delicious arguments that scientists and meteorologists have been having quietly for decades, and the residents of Oymyakon are largely unbothered by it either way, because they are too busy making sure their engines do not seize overnight. But let us give you a proper sensory orientation, because this is bedtime, and bedtime deserves to begin gently, even when the subject matter involves air that can freeze your corneas. Imagine, just for a moment, that you step outside. Not unprepared, we are not cruel here, but imagine you step outside, dressed in your normal winter coat, the kind you wear when it gets properly cold where you live. The moment the door opens, the air does not rush in so much as press in, like a solid thing, like a wall made of nothing. It hits your face first, because your face is, foolishly, the one part of you that is still exposed to the world. Your nostrils contract instantly. The tiny hairs inside them freeze on the first inhale, and you feel a strange, brittle sensation, as though someone has packed your airways with something crystalline and precise. Your first exhaled breath does not drift away lazily. It crackles outward in a plume of instant ice fog and falls, almost audibly, a phenomenon locals describe in Russian as the sound of freezing breath, sometimes translated poetically as the whisper of stars. At minus 71 degrees Celsius, the air is approximately 100 degrees colder than your freezer at home. Your freezer, by comparison, is practically a tropical holiday. Your eyelashes begin to ice over within seconds. If you are wearing glasses, the frames contract, and the lenses fog and freeze before you can wipe them. Metal, any metal, becomes dangerous to touch with bare skin, because at these temperatures, your skin will bond to it almost instantly, the moisture on your fingertips freezing into a bridge between flesh and steel that you will not enjoy breaking. The Saka people, who have lived in this landscape for generations beyond easy counting, have a saying that is roughly translated as, "Do not touch what the cold has already claimed." It applies to metal. It applies to certain rocks. It applies, in a philosophical sense, to ambition. The region that contains Oymyakon sits on what geographers and climatologists call the pole of cold, a term designating the area of the northern hemisphere that experiences the most extreme low temperatures. There are, technically, two candidates for this title: Oymyakon itself in the inhabited world and Verkhoyansk, a slightly larger and even more historically significant settlement a few hundred kilometers to the northwest, which recorded minus 67.8 degrees Celsius in 1892. Both towns have spent the better part of a century bickering over which is colder, and the rivalry is, honestly, one of the most charming inter-village disputes in the history of human settlement. Neither town is warm. Both towns are absolutely correct to be proud of surviving. You might be wondering, quite reasonably, why anyone lives here at all. It is a fair question. It is the kind of question that a warm person asks, and it deserves a warm person's answer, which is to say, it is complicated, it is historical, it is cultural, and it makes a great deal more sense than it sounds. The Saka people, the indigenous inhabitants of this republic, are Turkic in origin, and their ancestors migrated north across what is now central Russia many centuries ago, bringing cattle, horses, and a cultural adaptability that would prove, over generations, to be their greatest survival tool. They did not arrive in Yakutia because it was inviting. They arrived because of the slow push and pull of migration, of conflict with other groups further south, of a gradual northward movement along river valleys that must have seemed, at the time, like a reasonable path through the landscape. Over centuries, the Saka developed a relationship with the cold that is less about endurance and more about understanding. They did not fight the climate. They read it. They interpreted it. They built entire systems of knowledge about animals, about food, about shelter, about the behavior of ice and snow and permafrost, that allowed not just survival but a genuine, textured, communal life in conditions that would strike most of the world as uninhabitable. The Soviet Union had its own reasons for populating the region further, of course. Yakutia is extraordinarily rich in natural resources. Diamonds, gold, tin, coal, and the Gulag system, grimly and efficiently, filled remote corners of the republic with labor. Some of those who came to Yakutia as prisoners stayed after the camps because leaving was complicated, or because they had built something they were reluctant to abandon, or simply because the cold had, in the strange way that extreme places sometimes do, gotten into them. Historians still argue whether the forced migration of the Stalin era ultimately helped or damaged the long-term development of the region's infrastructure, and that argument, too, is ongoing, quiet, and unlikely to be resolved by bedtime. The modern town of Oymyakon has, at any given count, somewhere between 500 and a few hundred more inhabitants, depending on the season and who is asking. There is a school. There is a local administration building. There is a monument, a simple stone marker, that stands at the edge of the settlement and announces, with a kind of cheerful defiance, that you are standing at the pole of cold. In summer, and there is a summer, remarkable as that seems, temperatures can climb to a genuinely pleasant 20 degrees Celsius or above, which means Oymyakon holds another distinction, one of the greatest annual temperature ranges of any permanently inhabited place on Earth. 90 degrees of difference, from the warmth of a summer afternoon to the bone-shattering floor of a January night. Tourists come, increasingly, in winter. They fly into Yakutsk, the regional capital, and then make the roughly 1,000-kilometer journey along a road colloquially known as the Road of Bones, named for the prisoners who died building it and whose remains, according to persistent local memory, were sometimes incorporated into the road's foundations. It is not a cheerful name, but it is an honest one, and the road earns it. In deep winter, the highway is drivable only because the ground is frozen solid enough to bear the weight of vehicles. In spring, When the thaw begins its slow, complicated work, sections of it become impassable. The permafrost giveth, and the permafrost taketh away. But that is for later. For now it is night. It is deeply, completely, profoundly night. The kind of night that exists only this far north, in the deep of winter, when the sun does not bother to rise at all, or rises for perhaps an hour. A pale, apologetic smear of gray light along the southern horizon, before giving up and retreating again. The stars overhead are extraordinary. At -71 degrees Celsius, the atmosphere is so clear, so devoid of the moisture that usually softens and hazes a night sky, that the stars are sharp as cut glass, vivid as electric light, close enough. It seems foolishly that you might reach up and touch them. You will not be doing that tonight. Your hands are warm. Your blanket is heavy. The cold is somewhere else, on the other side of the world, doing what it has always done, which is persist and wait and keep its patient, absolute counsel. Close your eyes just a little. We are only getting started. The name Oymyakon itself is worth a quiet moment of consideration as you settle in. In the Yakut language, the language of the Saka people, a Turkic tongue that has evolved over centuries of contact with Russian, with neighboring indigenous languages, and with the specific demands of describing a landscape that most languages never needed words for, the name is generally translated as something along the lines of unfrozen water, or place where water does not freeze. This is not a joke, though it sounds like one. There is a hot spring near the settlement, a thermal spring that keeps a small patch of ground and water perpetually above freezing, that likely gave the place its name long before anyone thought to measure how cold the air above it could get in January. The spring is still there. It still does not freeze. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most defiant small features of a landscape that seems otherwise entirely committed to the idea of freezing absolutely everything without exception. The quirky, almost surreal contrast of a thermal spring sitting in the coldest inhabited place on Earth is the kind of detail that makes you wonder, not for the last time tonight, whether the universe has a slightly absurdist sense of humor. A warm patch of water, stubbornly liquid, surrounded by air cold enough to freeze diesel fuel in under an hour. It is almost poetic. It is definitely the kind of thing that someone, somewhere, has written a very long poem about. Geography shapes everything here, and the geography of the Oymyakon Valley is worth picturing clearly if you want to understand why it is so extraordinarily cold even relative to other parts of Yakutia, which are themselves already extremely cold. The valley sits between mountain ranges that block the movement of warmer air systems from the south and west. Weather patterns that bring mild air up from Central Asia and the Pacific get deflected or blocked long before they reach this particular hollow in the earth. What flows in, instead, is Arctic air, the cold, dry, ancient air masses that form over the Arctic Ocean and drift southward in winter, pooling in low-lying terrain and settling there like something that has decided it belongs. The absence of moisture in this air is significant. Yakutia in winter is technically a cold desert. Snowfall is relatively modest, nothing like the heavy, photogenic snowfalls of, say, Scandinavia or the Canadian Rockies. What falls stays because it never melts. But the sky is often clear, and clear skies mean no insulating cloud layer, which means the ground radiates heat away into space with terrifying efficiency every night, and the air near the surface grows colder and colder in a process called radiative cooling. On a clear, still, dry January night in the Oymyakon Valley, this process runs unchecked, and the temperature drops and keeps dropping until it reaches levels that feel less like weather and more like a geological fact, like gravity or the hardness of stone. The sensation of cold at these extremes is not the sharp, biting cold of a windy winter day in Chicago or Edinburgh. There is no wind. In deep cold like this, atmospheric conditions are often perfectly still, because the air itself is so dense and settled that it barely moves. The cold at -71 degrees Celsius is quiet. It is total. It presses against every surface with an even, unwavering pressure, and it does not sting so much as simply take. It takes heat from metal, from stone, from wood, from skin, with a calm thoroughness that has no particular malice in it. It is not angry cold. It is indifferent cold, which is somehow more unsettling. Sound behaves differently in extreme cold. The speed of sound decreases as temperature drops, and at -71 degrees Celsius, sounds travel slightly differently through the air than you are used to. More practically, The cold air is so dense that sounds carry in unexpected ways. A dog barking a kilometer away can sound startlingly close. A footstep on compacted snow produces a sound that is less a crunch and more a sharp ceramic squeak, because the snow crystals have been compressed by the cold into something almost glassy. Old-timers in Oymyakon will tell you that you can hear the cold coming, not as a wind, but as a change in the quality of silence, a deepening of the stillness that signals the temperature is about to drop another notch. There are 3 weather vanes in Oymyakon, according to local lore, and none of them move much in January. There is an old joke, one of many, that goes roughly like this. In Oymyakon, we don't need a weatherman. The weather only does one thing in January, and we already know what it is. That dry, resigned humor runs through Yakut culture in a way that feels less like coping and more like genuine philosophical orientation. The cold is not a disaster. The cold is not an emergency. The cold is simply the condition of existence here, the background against which everything else, love, food, story, sleep, takes place. You might find, as you lie there in the warmth of your bed, that this idea is oddly comforting. The cold as background, the extreme as ordinary. There is something almost meditative about a place so committed to a single, uncompromising condition that everything else, every tool, every habit, every relationship, every piece of architecture, has been shaped around it with centuries of patient refinement. Nothing in Oymyakon is accidental. Nothing is unconsidered. Every detail of daily life there is the product of a long negotiation between human need and atmospheric fact. The permafrost beneath the valley, and we will get to permafrost properly soon because it deserves its own chapter in this story, extends downward for hundreds of meters. In some parts of Yakutia, the frozen ground reaches down more than 1.5 kilometers below the surface, an almost incomprehensible depth of icebound earth that has not thawed since the Pleistocene. Mammoths walked over this ground. Their frozen remains are still pulled from it, occasionally by erosion or by deliberate excavation. Not skeletal remains, but actual bodies, sometimes with fur and soft tissue still intact after tens of thousands of years, preserved by the same cold that makes January here so profound. Yakutia has given the world more woolly mammoth specimens than almost anywhere else on Earth, and the locals have a complicated relationship with these ancient neighbors, part reverence, part practical interest, since mammoth ivory has historically been a valuable trade good. The indigenous cosmology of the Saka people has room for this, for the idea that the earth gives back what it has held, that the deep cold is a kind of memory, a repository of time. There is no sharp line in traditional Saka thought between the living landscape and the historical one. The permafrost is not inert. It is full, and occasionally it lets something go. Tonight, though, you are not thinking about permafrost cosmology. Tonight, you are letting the temperature figures settle in your mind like snow, slowly, softly. -71 degrees. A number that does not quite compute, that the human brain does not quite know what to do with because we are not built for numbers that large on a thermometer. 40 below, most cold climate people will tell you, is the point at which Fahrenheit and Celsius meet. The one temperature where both scales agree, the point of convergence where the universe briefly stops arguing with itself about units. -71 degrees Celsius is almost 31 degrees past that convergence point. It is cold in a way that requires new vocabulary. The Saka language, as it happens, has an extensive vocabulary for different kinds of cold: cold with wind, cold without wind, the particular cold of a clear night, the slightly different cold of an overcast one, the cold that comes before a snowfall versus the cold that settles in after. English has cold and very cold and extremely cold and then, somewhat defeatedly, really extremely cold. The Saka vocabulary for temperature and winter conditions runs to dozens of distinct terms, a linguistic map of a landscape that most languages never needed to describe in such detail. Linguists find this endlessly interesting. There is an ongoing scholarly debate, gentle, mostly good-natured, about whether having more words for something actually changes how you experience it, or whether the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that language shapes perception, is doing useful work here or simply providing a framework that feels more meaningful than it is. Historians still argue whether the richness of cold vocabulary in languages like Yakut and Inuktitut represents a genuine cognitive difference, or simply reflects the practical need to communicate precise information in environments where precision about the cold could mean the difference between a productive day and a fatal one. The argument continues. It will probably continue long past tonight. For now, the cold has a name. The cold has a place. The cold is somewhere on the other side of a very large, round planet from where you are lying right now, and it is doing what it always does, whispering its frost into the dark, turning breath to crystal, keeping its long, patient, extraordinary counsel. You are warm. You are safe. The stars over Oymyakon are extraordinary tonight. Yakutsk is not a city that apologizes for itself. It sits on the western bank of the Lena River, roughly 500 kilometers southwest of Oymyakon, and it is the coldest major city on Earth, a title it holds with the same quiet, slightly tired pride that very cold places tend to develop when they have been extreme long enough to stop being surprised by it. With a population of around 300,000 people, it is a real, functioning, modern city, with universities and shopping centers and traffic jams and all the mundane apparatus of contemporary urban life, except that all of it, every single bit of it, has been engineered around a problem that no other major city on Earth has had to solve quite so comprehensively. The ground beneath Yakutsk does not behave like ground anywhere else. It is frozen. It has always been frozen. It will be frozen, barring the kinds of climatic changes that nobody in Yakutsk particularly wants to contemplate too closely, for a very long time yet. And building a city on top of it, as the Russians discovered with considerable expense and frustration over several centuries, is one of the more technically demanding things a civilization can attempt. You are walking through Yakutsk now in your imagination, in the deep of a January night, and the first thing you notice, after the cold, which you have already made your uneasy peace with, is the buildings. They are, almost without exception, raised off the ground. Not dramatically, not in the way of houses on stilts in flood-prone tropical regions, but deliberately, precisely on concrete or metal piles driven deep into the permafrost so that there is a gap, sometimes half a meter, sometimes more, between the bottom of the building and the surface of the earth. This gap is not aesthetic. It is not architectural whimsy. It is the solution to a problem that the early Soviet planners learned about in the most expensive possible way. If you build a heated structure directly on permafrost, the heat from the building conducts into the frozen ground below, begins to thaw it, and the thawing ground becomes soft, unstable, and deeply uninterested in continuing to support the weight of whatever you have put on top of it. Buildings sink. They tilt. They crack. They develop the architectural personality of a ship caught in a slow, grinding storm, and they do so over years and decades, which is in some ways worse than a quick disaster because the slow-motion ruin is expensive, difficult to arrest, and deeply demoralizing. The Soviets, to their considerable credit, eventually figured this out and developed the pile-driving technique that defines Yakutsk's skyline. The piles, sometimes made of concrete, sometimes of steel, are driven down through the active layer, the shallow surface layer of ground that freezes and thaws seasonally, and into the stable permafrost below, where they anchor the building above the ground surface and allow cold air to circulate in the gap underneath, keeping the permafrost frozen and the building stable. It is an elegant solution in principle. In practice, it requires constant monitoring because permafrost is not uniform. It has warmer and colder sections, areas of ice-rich soil and areas of drier frozen ground, and a pile that was perfectly stable in 1970 may have shifted subtly by 2024 as ground temperatures inch upward. The engineers of Yakutsk spend a great deal of their professional lives thinking about ground temperatures, which is either very interesting or very stressful, depending on your disposition. Walking between the buildings, you notice the gaps at their bases. Dark, cold spaces, open to the January air, where stray dogs sometimes shelter and where, in summer, the exposed ground thaws into a muddy, complicated layer that smells of ancient earth and something older underneath. In winter, these gaps are ice-filled cavities, utterly still, colder even than the air above them. Small pockets of the deep freeze tucked under the foundations of apartment blocks and government offices and the regional hospital. There is something quietly surreal about a hospital built on stilts over permafrost, something that requires a moment of philosophical adjustment. This place of warmth and healing, elevated above the cold ground, held up by rods driven into thousand-year-old ice. Not all the buildings in Yakutsk are perfectly stable, of course. Some of the older Soviet-era structures, the ones built before the pile-driving technique was fully standardized, or the ones where the piles were installed without sufficient care, or the ones where the permafrost beneath has been altered by changing drainage patterns or increasing temperatures, have developed what architects and engineers in Yakutia euphemistically call differential settlement, which is the technical term for what happens when part of a building sinks and the other part does not. Walk down certain streets in Yakutsk and you will see apartment blocks that lean at angles improbable enough to make a visitor do a quiet double-take. Buildings where the window frames have warped and the doors no longer quite close properly, and the stairwells have developed a gentle but persistent slope that makes descending them feel faintly dreamlike. People live in these buildings. They have lived in them for decades. They have developed, as humans invariably do, a perfectly comfortable relationship with the tilt, and regard visitors who stare at their wonky windowsills with the patient tolerance of people who have long since stopped finding this remarkable. There is a building in Yakutsk, not quite a tourist attraction but certainly a point of local interest, that leans so decisively in one direction that it has been internally retrofitted with sloped floors to compensate, so that furniture placed inside sits level even though the building itself does not. This is either ingenious or an act of collective denial, depending on your architectural philosophy, and the residents would probably tell you it is both, and that both are fine. The permafrost engineering challenges extend underground as well. Yakutsk has a system of utilities, water, sewage, heating, and delivering these through a frozen city presents problems that engineers in warmer climates never have to consider. Water pipes that run underground in most cities cannot simply be buried in Yakutsk's active layer, because the freeze-thaw cycle of that layer, freezing in winter, thawing in summer, would rupture conventional pipes within a season or two. Instead, many utilities in Yakutsk are carried in above-ground insulated conduits, large, lagged pipes and cable bundles that run at chest height through the streets, crossing roads on elevated bridges, creating a kind of secondary infrastructure network that loops and branches through the city at human scale. Walk through a residential district of Yakutsk and these conduits are everywhere, thick as tree trunks, draped in insulation that is itself covered in a steel or aluminium outer casing, crossing your path every block or so. They are, once you know what they are, one of the most visually distinctive features of the city, the visible signature of a place that has had to externalize its infrastructure because the ground will not cooperate. Heating is, naturally, the great preoccupation of Yakutsk's municipal engineering. The city is served by a centralized district heating system, the Soviet model, still operating, in which large boiler plants burn coal and natural gas to produce hot water and steam, which is then piped through those insulated above-ground conduits to radiators in homes and public buildings throughout the city. The system was designed for a specific population and a specific urban footprint, and it has been expanded, repaired, adapted, and occasionally cursed at over the decades as the city grew and the infrastructure aged. In deep winter, a failure in the district heating system is not a minor inconvenience. It is an emergency and a rapid one, because an unheated apartment at -50 degrees Celsius ambient outdoor temperature will drop to unlivable temperatures within hours. Yakutsk's heating utility workers occupy a social status somewhere between essential public servants and quiet civic heroes, and they are, in January, extremely busy. The ground itself, beneath the city, is monitored with a network of temperature sensors and observation wells, essentially boreholes drilled into the permafrost at various depths, in which instruments record the temperature of the frozen ground over time. This monitoring network exists partly for engineering purposes and partly for scientific ones, because Yakutia is one of the most important places in the world for understanding how permafrost responds to climate change. Carbon that, if the permafrost thaws, will be decomposed by microbes and released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and methane. Historians still argue about the precise timeline and magnitude of permafrost carbon feedback loops, and climate scientists have increasingly pointed to Yakutia's monitoring data as some of the most important long-term temperature records on Earth. The people of Yakutsk are, without particularly choosing to be, living in one of the planet's most important climate observatories. But the city is also, simply, a city, and cities have texture and commerce and personality, and Yakutsk's personality is distinctive in ways that go beyond its engineering peculiarities. The outdoor market, the central market, where food and goods are traded year-round, operates in winter in ways that visitors find startling. Fish, for instance, are sold frozen solid, stacked like cord wood, their scales glittering with frost, their shapes absolutely rigid. You pick up a fish in Yakutsk's winter market the way you might pick up a piece of timber. It is hard, it is fixed, it will not bend. Meat is similar, frozen so solidly that the vendors use axes and handsaws to portion it. The sound of steel on frozen flesh carrying cleanly through the cold air of the market in short, sharp percussive reports. This is not considered remarkable. This is Tuesday. One of the quirkier features of Yakutsk's winter market is the egg situation. Eggs, at minus 50 degrees Celsius, freeze faster than you might expect, and a frozen egg, once thawed, changes texture in ways that make it less useful for certain culinary purposes. Yakutsk residents have developed a brisk trade in eggs transported in insulated containers and sold from heated stalls. And there is a long-standing local joke, which, like all good local jokes, contains genuine logistical information, that the freshness of eggs in Yakutsk's market is measured not in days but in whether they are still round. A frozen egg, when it freezes, expands and can crack its shell. A cracked egg in minus 50 degrees Celsius is already categorically a different kind of purchase than an intact one. The city has a mammoth museum because of course it does. This is a place that periodically produces actual frozen mammoths from its soil, and the museum displays specimens and reconstructions with the quiet pride of a city that has a genuinely unique natural heritage. There is also a Permafrost Institute, a serious scientific establishment that conducts research into the frozen ground and has, among its more surreal features, a series of underground tunnels and chambers dug directly into the permafrost for use as research environments. These underground rooms, carved into frozen earth at temperatures of minus 5 to minus 10 degrees Celsius year-round, are used for storing food, for scientific experiments, and occasionally for cooling enthusiastic visitors who perhaps did not entirely believe what the thermometer outside was reading. Yakutsk also has a diamond exchange, which makes it one of very few cities on Earth where the distance between the world's deepest cold and the world's most expensive small objects is measurable in city blocks. Yakutia produces roughly a quarter of the world's rough diamonds. The Mir mine, now closed but still one of the largest diamond mines ever excavated, left a hole in the Yakutian earth large enough to create its own weather system, a fact that sounds like a metaphor but is technically accurate. The pit was so deep and wide that helicopters had to take circuitous routes to avoid being dragged downward by the convection currents above the open shaft. The diamonds extracted from Yakutia's mines have sat in engagement rings and museum displays and investment vaults all over the world, and almost none of the people who own them have any idea that they came from the coldest city on Earth, carried out of the ground by workers who drove to the mine in cars with engine block heaters running continuously throughout their shifts. The streets of Yakutsk in January have a specific quality of light, or, more precisely, of near darkness, that you should picture as you settle deeper into your pillow. The sun in deep winter rises for perhaps 3 or 4 hours, reaching a low angle above the southern horizon that produces a kind of long, raking, golden-blue twilight rather than true daylight, and then it is gone again. Streetlights come on in the early afternoon and stay on until late morning. Shop windows glow amber and white. The breath of pedestrians, the few who are out, because sensible people are inside, rises in plumes and hangs in the still air as ice fog, a low, ground-level cloud of frozen breath that gathers at street corners and thickens over warm exhaust vents. Walking through this ice fog is walking through something almost magical, a cold mist of communal exhalation, every person who has passed this spot in the last hour contributing their small cloud to the quiet, frozen accumulation. Cars idle constantly. You do not turn off your car in Yakutsk in January, at least not outdoors, because a car that has been shut off for more than a few hours in minus 50 degrees Celsius may not start again. The engine oil thickens, the battery dies, the diesel gels. Cars in Yakutsk are kept running not from wastefulness but from necessity, and the low, continuous rumble of idling engines is one of the background sounds of the winter city, a mechanical heartbeat that runs day and night. Garages, real, heated garages, are among the most prized pieces of real estate in the city, because a car in a heated garage is a car that will start tomorrow morning, which is an outcome so desirable that it justifies considerable expenditure. The residential apartment blocks of Yakutsk, many of them Soviet-era concrete panel construction, the ubiquitous Khrushchev-era blocks that dot cities across the former Soviet Union, have been adapted for the cold in ways both official and improvised. Windows are triple or quadruple glazed, sometimes with a fourth inner layer added by residents themselves, a sheet of plastic or an extra pane of glass sealed into the frame with tape and silicone as a supplementary barrier against the cold. Some apartments have outer airlock vestibules, a small, cold room between the outer door and the inner door of the apartment, a transition zone where you stamp snow from your boots and shed your outermost layer before entering the warmth of the home proper. These vestibules are also used for cold storage. A freezer, in Yakutsk, is a concept almost redundant in winter, since anything left in the vestibule or on an outdoor windowsill will be preserved at temperatures colder than any mechanical refrigeration unit can achieve. You are picturing this city now, perhaps, as you drift a little. Its tilting buildings and elevated pipes, its ice-fog streets and amber-lit market stalls, its diamonds and mammoths and idling engines and triple-glazed windows. It is, in every sense, a city built against the natural order of things, a warm, human place imposed on a landscape that was not particularly interested in warmth or humans, and maintained by the continuous, expensive, ingenious, sometimes improvised effort of the people who have decided, generation after generation, that this frozen valley is where they belong. There is something quietly admirable about that decision, something that you can hold lightly, warmly, as you let your eyes close just a little more. The city hums. The engines idle. The permafrost waits. The first thing you learn, when you are being dressed for -71 degrees Celsius by someone who knows what they are doing, is that you have been thinking about warmth incorrectly your entire life. You have been thinking about warmth as something you add. A coat you put on, a scarf you wrap around, a hat you pull down over your ears before you step outside into whatever passes for cold in your part of the world. You have been thinking of clothing as a supplement to your body's natural warmth, a top-up, a finishing touch. The Saka people, who have been refining the art of cold-weather dressing for more centuries than anyone has bothered to count precisely, think about it entirely differently. They think about clothing as a system for managing what you already have, for capturing the heat your body generates and keeping it from escaping into air that will take it from you with complete and total efficiency. You are not adding warmth. You are containing it. And the difference between those two philosophies at -71 degrees Celsius is the difference between a productive day and a very short one. You are going to get dressed now. It will take a while. That is the point. The base layer goes on first, and in the traditional Saka approach, this means animal skin against your skin. Specifically, the processed hide of reindeer worn with the fur facing inward toward your body so that the thousands of hollow, air-filled hairs of the reindeer's winter coat form a layer of insulating microclimate directly against your skin. Reindeer fur is one of the more extraordinary natural materials on the planet, and it is worth appreciating for a moment before you pull it on. Each individual hair of a reindeer's winter coat is hollow. Not just tubular, but genuinely hollow at its core, like a tiny drinking straw made of keratin, and this hollow structure traps air more efficiently than almost any other natural fiber. A square centimeter of reindeer fur contains thousands of these hollow hairs, each one holding a tiny column of air warmed by the body beneath it, each one contributing its small fraction to the overall insulating performance of the hide. It is nature's own version of aerogel insulation, evolved over millions of years of Arctic selection pressure, and no synthetic material, not Gore-Tex, not Thinsulate, not the most advanced laboratory-produced performance fleece, has yet fully matched it for warmth-to-weight ratio in the specific conditions of extreme dry cold. The Saka processing of reindeer hide is itself an art form, one that has been practiced and refined by women across generations. The knowledge held, transmitted, demonstrated, and corrected within family and community networks in a manner that makes it something between craft and scholarship. The raw hide must be cleaned, softened, and processed using a combination of mechanical working, scraping, stretching, kneading, and sometimes fermentation or other treatments that break down the stiffness of the skin and make it supple enough to wear comfortably against the body. A poorly processed hide is stiff and uncomfortable and will crack in the cold. A well-processed hide is almost as soft as fabric, flexible enough to move with the body without restricting circulation, and will last for years of hard winter use. The women who do this work are not simply tailors. They are engineers of survival, and the Saka community knows it. Your base layer, then, is on. You feel the prickle of inward-facing fur against your skin. Not unpleasant, actually rather pleasant. like being wrapped in something that has already decided to take care of you. The middle layers come next, and here the philosophy of trapping air becomes explicit and architectural. You are building a house for your body heat. The middle layers are typically made from the same reindeer or other animal materials. Sometimes domesticated reindeer, sometimes wild animals, sometimes a combination depending on what was available and what the specific purpose of the garment demands. And they are designed to create additional air pockets, additional dead zones of warm, still air between your body and the outside world. Each layer is slightly looser than the one beneath it, allowing air to pool in the spaces between, creating a stratified insulating system that works on the same principle as double-glazed windows, not just the material itself, but the trapped air between materials doing most of the thermal work. The outer layer, the parka, or what the Saka call the doha in certain regional variants, is the layer that faces the world, and it is a serious piece of engineering. Made from reindeer or horse hide with the fur facing outward, it is cut long enough to reach well below the knees, with a hood that can be drawn tight around the face to leave only the eyes and perhaps the nose exposed. The hood is not a simple, rudimentary thing. It is designed and cut with considerable precision, shaped so that when it is fully closed it creates a small, relatively still airspace in front of the face, a microenvironment slightly warmer than the ambient air, a buffer zone between your nose and the -71°C world beyond. Some traditional designs incorporate a ruff of wolf or wolverine fur around the outer edge of the hood, and this is not decorative, or rather, it is decorative, but it is also functional because the structure of wolf and wolverine fur is particularly resistant to icing from exhaled breath. At -71°C, every exhalation you make deposits moisture as ice on whatever it contacts, and a hood ruff that ices over quickly becomes a rigid, uncomfortable, poorly sealing ring around your face. Wolf fur, for reasons that have been studied but not entirely resolved, does not ice in the same way, and the Saka figured this out empirically long before anyone was applying the scientific method to hood ruff selection. The outer parka is typically laced or tied rather than buttoned. Metal buttons are a liability at extreme cold, not just because they are uncomfortable to manipulate with gloved hands, but because metal conducts heat away from whatever it contacts with enthusiastic efficiency. And a row of metal buttons pressed against your chest is a row of small, persistent thermal bridges between your warm body and the cold outside. Laces, made from hide or sinew, do not conduct heat. They close the garment adequately. They are right and buttons are wrong, and the Saka worked this out centuries before materials science had language for it. Your feet deserve special attention, because feet are where many cold weather strategies fail catastrophically, and the Saka approach to footwear is a masterclass in the application of layered philosophy to a specific anatomical challenge. The traditional boot, the torbesa, is a knee-high construction made, again, from reindeer hide, often with the bottom portion made from the particularly tough, thick skin taken from the legs of the reindeer, which has a natural texture that provides grip on ice and compacted snow. Inside the boot, you wear several layers, an inner sock of soft fur, a middle layer of dried grass, and this is the quirky, unexpected detail that tends to stop people cold, so to speak. Because grass sounds like exactly the wrong material for extreme cold footwear, yet dried sedge grass has excellent insulating properties, conforms to the shape of the foot, wicks moisture away from the skin, and can be replaced when it becomes damp, making it a kind of disposable insole that also does most of the thermal work in the lower part of the boot. The Saka have used dried grass insoles for so long that the practice is documented in some of the earliest ethnographic records of the region. Modern materials scientists who have studied the thermal performance of traditional Yakutian footwear systems have, with some consistency, concluded that the combination of layered fur, dried grass, and reindeer leg-hide outer boot performs comparably to the best modern cold-weather footwear available, and that in very dry, very extreme cold, the traditional system sometimes outperforms synthetic alternatives because it manages moisture better. Your hands are next. Mittens, not gloves. This is not a preference, but a thermal law. Gloves separate your fingers, isolating each one in its own individual channel of warm air, which sounds logical but is thermally suboptimal because individual fingers lose heat faster than fingers grouped together and sharing their warmth. Mittens keep the fingers together, allowing them to warm each other, maintaining a communal microclimate inside the mitten shell that is several degrees warmer than a glove interior in comparable conditions. At -71°C, those several degrees are not a comfort metric. They are a frostbite prevention strategy. The saka mitten is typically double-layered, an inner mitten of soft fur that can be worn alone for tasks requiring moderate dexterity, and an outer shell of tougher hide that goes on for heavy exposure. When fine manipulation is required, adjusting equipment, handling tools, dealing with the endless fiddly logistics of cold environment life, you briefly remove the outer shell, perform the task as quickly as possible with the inner mitten or with bare hands if absolutely necessary, and replace the shell immediately. The brevity of that exposure is not optional. At -71 degrees Celsius, bare skin loses meaningful heat to the environment within seconds. The face is the final challenge, and the most difficult because the face must remain at least partially exposed for vision and for breath. Traditional saka cold weather practice does not include full face coverage in the way of, say, a balaclava, partly because full coverage makes breathing more difficult in extreme cold and partly because the moisture from exhaled breath saturates fabric face coverings quickly, creating an iced layer against the skin that then conducts heat away rather than retaining it. Instead, the face is protected primarily by the shaped hood. By strategic positioning of the body relative to wind, even the slight convective air movement of walking can dramatically increase heat loss from exposed facial skin, and by the traditional knowledge of when to be outside and when not to be. That last element is perhaps the most important and the most difficult to quantify. The decision about when cold exposure is acceptable and when it is dangerous is not made by consulting a chart or an app. It is made from embodied knowledge, from years of experience in a specific landscape, from familiarity with the behavior of one's own body in specific cold conditions. The saka concept of cold tolerance is not a fixed threshold but a dynamic, context-dependent assessment that takes into account wind, humidity, the individual's recent physical activity and nutrition, the quality of their clothing, and the distance to shelter. It is, in modern terms, an integrated risk assessment performed instinctively and continuously by people who have grown up doing it, and it cannot be straightforwardly transferred to someone who has not. Historians still argue whether the extraordinary cold adaptation of traditional Yakutian clothing represents an isolated development specific to the saka and their reindeer-herding neighbors, or whether similar solutions were developed independently across other Arctic and subarctic cultures and the similarities represent convergent functional evolution, different peoples arriving at similar answers to identical thermodynamic problems. The parallel development of hollow fur base layers among Inuit peoples in the Canadian Arctic, the use of layered systems among Siberian Yupik groups, the dried grass insole appearing in various forms across subarctic Asia. All of these suggest that the physics of extreme cold have a way of guiding human ingenuity towards similar conclusions regardless of cultural starting points. The cold does not care about your cultural heritage. It only cares about your insulating strategy. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, definitely instructive, that circulates among people who study traditional Arctic clothing and among the guides who lead winter tourists into the Yakutian interior. A Western visitor, equipped with the finest modern cold weather gear available from the best outdoor retailers, accompanied a group of saka hunters on a winter outing. The temperature was in the -50s. The visitors' gear was technically rated for lower temperatures than they encountered. And yet, by the afternoon, the visitor was significantly colder and more uncomfortable than their saka companions, who were wearing traditional clothing that had not been manufactured in a factory or rated by any laboratory. The difference, the guides explained afterward, was not the material rating but the system. The visitor's gear was designed for individual components to perform in isolation. The saka clothing was designed as a unified system, in which every layer interacted with every other layer, in which the proportions and fits and openings and closures had been calibrated over generations for exactly this temperature range in exactly this type of still, dry cold. Gear rated for -80 degrees Celsius worn incorrectly is less effective than gear rated for -40 degrees Celsius worn as part of a coherent, well-understood system. The system is the technology. You are now, in your imagination, fully dressed. You are wearing layers of reindeer hide, a long outer parka with a wolf fur ruff, knee-high boots with grass insoles, layered mittens, and a hood drawn close around a face that is, for the moment, the only exposed part of you. You are warm, remarkably, comprehensively warm, in a way that feels almost incongruous given the number on the thermometer. The layers do not feel heavy in the way that many layers of synthetic clothing do. They feel present. They feel inhabited. They feel like something that has been made specifically for you, by someone who understood what you would need before you needed it. Which, in a very real sense, is exactly what has happened. Except that the someone in question is not a single person but a long chain of people stretching back through generations, each one adding a small refinement, correcting a small error, passing along a small piece of knowledge that made the whole system fractionally better, fractionally more reliable, fractionally more likely to bring the person wearing it home at the end of the day. Outside, the temperature is -71 degrees Celsius. The stars are sharp as cut glass. The snow under your boots squeaks with that specific cold compressed ceramic sound that you have now learned to recognize. Your breath rises in a brief plume inside the microclimate of your hood and disperses harmlessly, taking nothing of consequence with it. You are dressed for this. You are ready for this. In a way, you have been made for this, not biologically, not originally, but culturally, technologically, through the slow accumulated wisdom of people who chose, generation after generation, to stay in the coldest place on Earth and figure out how to live there well. The morning is still hours away. The cold is patient. So are you. The dog is already awake when you are not. This is not a dereliction of duty on your part. It is simply the nature of the Yakutia Laika, the breed that has lived alongside the Saka people for so long that the relationship between dog and human in this landscape has become something beyond utility, something closer to a mutual agreement about how life in extreme cold is best organized. An agreement reached over so many generations that neither party entirely remembers negotiating it. The dog is awake, and it is outside, and the temperature is -60 degrees Celsius, and the dog is fine. More than fine, actually. The dog is, by all observable measures, completely in its element, curled in a tight circle on the snow with its thick tail wrapped over its nose. Its core temperature maintained by a metabolic and insulative system so perfectly calibrated for this environment that it requires no intervention, no supplementary heating, no special consideration beyond the basic provision of food and water and the kind of companionship that working dogs in remote places have always relied upon. The dog does not need your cabin. The dog has merely decided, as a matter of social preference and long habit, that it would like to be near it. This is the detail embedded in tonight's title that deserves its proper unpacking, because it is funnier and more instructive than it first appears. When we say that even the dogs refuse to leave the cabin, we are not describing dogs huddled against the door in desperation, whimpering against the cold that threatens to overwhelm them. We are describing something more complicated and more interesting, dogs that are physiologically equipped to handle temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes, choosing, as a matter of social and emotional preference, to remain close to the human settlement not because they must but because they want to. The Yakutia Laika does not need your cabin. It has been surviving Yakutia winters since before your cabin's architectural predecessors were first assembled. What the dog wants is the warmth of proximity, not thermal warmth but social warmth, the warmth of being near the people it has worked beside and eaten beside and slept near for the entirety of its lived experience. At -71 degrees Celsius, the dog is choosing you. That should probably make you feel something. The Yakutia Laika is a breed, or more precisely, a type, since the specific standardization of the breed has been a relatively recent and somewhat incomplete project, that has been shaped by the same relentless selection pressure that shaped Saka clothing and Saka architecture and Saka food, the pressure of extreme cold, applied over an enormously long time, to a population that could not afford to carry individuals who were not suited to the work. The dogs that survived Yakutia winters and thrived in them were the dogs that bred. The dogs that couldn't manage were not bred, or did not survive to breed, and over centuries this produced an animal with a double coat. A dense, soft undercoat that traps air in essentially the same way as reindeer fur, and a longer, coarser outer coat that sheds snow and ice and resists moisture penetration. A compact, efficient body shape that minimizes the surface area to volume ratio and therefore reduces heat loss, small ears that reduce the risk of frostbite to exposed cartilage, and a tail designed to be curled over the nose during sleep, providing a fur-lined mask for the most heat-sensitive part of the face. The paws of the Yakutia Laika are worth a specific moment of appreciation, because they are one of the more quietly remarkable examples of physiological adaptation to cold in any domestic animal. The blood vessels supplying the paws run in a countercurrent heat exchange system, Warm arterial blood flowing down from the body toward the paw passes alongside cool venous blood flowing back up from the cold extremity, and the two exchange heat through the vessel walls, so that arterial blood arriving at the paw is already pre-cooled and loses less heat to the cold ground, while venous blood returning to the body is pre-warmed and does not chill the core. The result is that the paws can operate at significantly lower temperatures than the body core without causing the physiological cascade of cold injury, and the dog can stand on ice at -60 degrees Celsius without its feet freezing in the way that yours would. This is not a learned behavior or a cultural adaptation. This is biology, written into the breed over generations of Yakutia winters. The uses of dogs in traditional Yakutia life are extensive and historically significant. Sled dogs, the Yakutia Laika working in teams, were the primary means of winter transport across the region for centuries, pulling loads across the frozen landscape at speeds and over distances that no other technology available in pre-industrial Siberia could match. The relationship between the musher and the lead dog, the dog at the front of the team who sets the pace, reads the terrain, makes the route decisions that keep the sled and its driver out of trouble, is one of those working partnerships that people who have experienced it describe with a reverence that can sound excessive until you have seen it firsthand. A good lead dog in Yakutian conditions is not simply following commands. It is exercising judgment, reading snow surfaces and ice conditions and wind changes, making continuous small decisions about speed and direction that the musher may ratify or correct, but that depend, fundamentally, on the dog's superior sensory engagement with the immediate environment. The dog smells what the human cannot see. The dog feels through its paws what the human's boots cannot detect. The dog knows things. There is a recorded account, passed through the oral tradition of several Yakutian communities and subsequently noted by ethnographers, of a dog team that refused, collectively and with considerable stubbornness, to cross a section of river ice that looked, to the human driver, perfectly solid. The dogs would not move forward. They planted their feet, leaned back against their harnesses, and would not be persuaded by any of the usual means. The driver, eventually, took a different route, and discovered the following day that the section of ice the dogs had refused to cross had a concealed thaw zone beneath it. A patch of ice thinned by an underwater spring, invisible from the surface, strong enough to hold the dogs' weight only because they had refused to be on it. Whether this story is precisely true in all its details is the kind of question historians still argue about in the comfortable warmth of university seminar rooms, but the underlying principle it illustrates, that working dogs in extreme cold environments develop sensory and experiential knowledge that can exceed human perception, is well documented and practically significant. Now, if the Yakutian Laika is the dog of the people, the Yakutian horse is arguably the more startling animal because horses are not, in the general imagination, cold-weather creatures. You picture horses in meadows, in temperate climates, in the kind of landscape where the grass is reliably accessible and the water reliably liquid and the temperatures reliably within a range that does not require extraordinary physiological accommodation. The Yakutian horse, the Yakut horse, a breed that has been in the region for at least 3,000 years and possibly considerably longer, has resolved to be unimpressed by this conventional wisdom. It winters outdoors, at -60 degrees Celsius, without supplementary feeding in traditional management practices, without shelter beyond whatever the landscape provides, in snow deep enough that foraging requires the horse to use its hooves to break through the ice crust and dig down to the dried grasses preserved beneath, a behavior called cratering that is specific to cold-adapted horse breeds and represents, in its own quiet way, a kind of bovine ingenuity that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Yakut horse is stocky, heavily built, with a barrel-shaped body, short legs, and a coat in winter that grows to a thickness and length remarkable for any horse. A shaggy, dense covering that can be several centimeters deep, giving the animal in full winter coat a slightly implausible, almost comical appearance, as though someone has dressed a horse in a rug and forgotten to take it off. Beneath that coat, the fat layer is substantial, built up during the summer and autumn when grazing is plentiful, serving as both insulation and caloric reserve for the months when foraging is harder and energy expenditure is higher. The mane grows long and thick enough to protect the neck and the tops of the shoulders. The forelock grows long enough to cover the eyes partially, providing some protection for that sensitive tissue. The hooves of the Yakut horse are harder than those of most other breeds. a genetic adaptation that allows them to strike ice and compacted snow without the brittleness that causes cracking in horses from warmer climates. The legs have proportionally more tendon and less exposed soft tissue than typical horse legs, reducing vulnerability to cold injury in the extremities. The digestive system is capable of extracting nutrition from the dried, frost-preserved grasses of a Yakutian winter with an efficiency that would be unremarkable in summer grazing conditions, but is extraordinary in conditions where the caloric content of available forage is at its lowest and the caloric demands of thermoregulation are at their highest. The Yakut horse has been described by veterinary researchers as one of the most cold-adapted large mammals in the world, and that description, while technically accurate, perhaps undersells the sheer implausibility of a horse standing placidly in -60 °C air, breathing clouds of frozen breath, systematically digging through half a meter of snow to eat dried grass, and looking, by every observable measure, completely unbothered. The relationship between the Saka people and their horses is ancient, deep, and not purely utilitarian. The horse in Saka culture carries spiritual and symbolic weight. It is associated with the upper world and with solar imagery in traditional Saka cosmology, connected to the concept of life force and prosperity in ways that elevate it beyond a working animal into something closer to a cultural symbol. The traditional Saka Spring Festival, Isiak, is centered around horses, kumis, fermented mare's milk, and the celebration of the returning sun, and the horse's ability to survive the Yakutian winter and emerge into spring, thin but alive, must have read to the people who depended on it as something almost miraculous, a yearly demonstration of endurance that reinforced the animal's symbolic standing. Reindeer, of course, are also essential to the cold weather ecology of this landscape, particularly in the more northern and nomadic communities of the Saka Republic, where horsekeeping is less practical and where the reindeer serves simultaneously as transport, food source, clothing material, and trade good. The domesticated reindeer of Yakutia, managed by several indigenous groups including the Evenki and the Yukagir, as well as some Saka communities, are not the same as the semi-wild reindeer of Scandinavian herding traditions, though they share the basic physiological toolkit of hollow hair insulation and large, concave hooves designed to distribute weight on snow and dig through it for forage. The reindeer in this landscape is the hinge species, the animal around which the entire survival system of the nomadic northern communities turns, providing almost everything needed to live through a winter that would otherwise be unsurvivable. The cattle of Yakutia deserve a brief mention, if only because the existence of cattle in a region this cold is itself a minor act of agricultural defiance. The Yakutian cattle breed stocky, short-legged, heavily coated by the standards of domestic cattle, was developed over centuries to survive conditions that would kill most modern commercial breeds within days. They are kept indoors through the worst of the winter, unlike the horses, but they are capable of tolerating outdoor temperatures and foraging conditions that no imported breed can match. Soviet-era agricultural policy repeatedly attempted to replace Yakutian cattle with higher-yielding breeds from warmer regions, on the grounds that productivity metrics favored the imports. The imports consistently failed to thrive or failed to survive in Yakutian conditions, and the local breeds survived the ideological pressure with the same stolid indifference it applied to the cold. It is still here. The imported breeds are mostly not. There are other animals in this landscape that deserve a moment of acknowledgement as you settle deeper into the warmth of your evening. Animals that live in the taiga and the tundra around the human settlements and that interact with human survival in various ways. The Siberian tiger, technically, has historical range that extends to the edges of the Yakutian region, though sightings are rare and populations are tiny. The brown bear hibernates through the worst of the winter in dens dug into hillsides, its metabolic rate dropping to a fraction of its active level, its body temperature declining slightly but not dramatically, its fat stores burning slowly through the months of cold. The wolverine, possibly the most durably impressive cold-weather predator in the taiga, does not hibernate at all, remaining active through the deepest winter, covering enormous ranges across the frozen landscape in pursuit of carrion and live prey, its fur so effective at preventing ice buildup that indigenous people across the Arctic have long used wolverine fur for the same hoodruff function that wolf fur serves in some Saka designs. The sable, the small mustelid whose pelt drove much of the Russian expansion into Siberia in the 16th and 17th centuries, lives in the Yakutia taiga in populations that have partially recovered from the hunting pressure of the fur trade era. The sable is active year-round, moving through the snow tunnels and subnivean spaces, the air-filled cavities that form between the snow surface and the ground, with a speed and agility that makes the winter landscape navigable for it in ways it is not for larger animals. Historians still argue about whether the Russian state's drive to extract sable and other furs from Siberia in the early modern period represents primarily an economic calculation, a territorial ambition, or a response to European fashion trends. The answer is probably all three, interwoven in the messy way that historical causation usually operates. But the consequence for Yakutia was the establishment of Russian administrative presence in a region that the Russian state might otherwise have taken considerably longer to reach. Back in the cabin, the dog has now decided that it is, after all, prepared to come inside. Not because the cold has beaten it. That is not what has happened, and you should not read it that way. The dog is coming inside because you are inside, and because the smell of food is a powerful argument in any temperature, and because the social contract between dog and human in this landscape is not just about work but about companionship, about the mutual warmth of shared space, about the particular comfort of having another warm body in the room when the thermometer outside reads numbers that the rest of the world finds difficult to believe. The dog circles twice, in the way that dogs do, tracing some ancient memory of grass flattening that has survived 10,000 years of domestication, and lies down near the fire. His thick tail wraps over its nose. Its eyes close with a completeness that suggests absolute confidence in the safety of this moment. The dog is not worried. The dog has done this before. The dog will do this again. Outside, the cold continues its patient, absolute work. Inside, the fire breathes. The dog sleeps. So might you. Hunger in extreme cold is not the quiet, polite suggestion it makes in temperate climates. The gentle reminder that it has been a few hours since lunch, the mild advisory that perhaps a snack would not go amiss. Hunger in minus 71 degrees Celsius is a demand. It is physiological insistence delivered with urgency because your body at extreme cold is burning calories at a rate that would alarm any nutritionist working from a standard reference chart. The basal metabolic rate, the number of calories your body burns simply to keep itself alive, before you have moved a single muscle or performed a single task, increases significantly in extreme cold because the body is working continuously and hard to maintain its core temperature against an environment that is taking heat from you with relentless, impersonal efficiency. Add to that the physical demands of moving through deep snow, of chopping wood, of managing animals, of performing the ordinary daily labor of life in a cold environment, and the caloric mathematics of surviving a Yakutian winter become genuinely startling. Estimates vary, but researchers studying cold climate energy expenditure have suggested that a person doing moderate physical work in conditions of minus 50 degrees Celsius and below may need anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day to maintain body weight and function, roughly twice to 3 times the standard recommendation for a sedentary adult in a temperate climate. The Saka diet has always known this, not as a calculation but as a felt, lived understanding of what the body requires when the world outside is trying to take everything it has. It is a diet built almost entirely around fat and protein, which is not a lifestyle choice or a dietary philosophy but a straightforward response to what is available and what works. The Yakutian landscape in winter does not offer fresh vegetables. It does not offer fruit. Grains in the traditional diet were limited and supplementary. What the landscape offers in abundance, or what human ingenuity has learned to extract from it in abundance, is animal fat and animal protein, in forms that have been refined over generations into a cuisine that is, by temperate world standards, confronting in its simplicity and directness, and that is, by any honest nutritional assessment, extraordinarily well adapted to its purpose. The centerpiece of Yakutian cold weather eating is, without question, stroganina, and this is worth your full, drowsy attention for a moment, because stroganina is one of the more remarkable food traditions in the world, remarkable not for complexity but for its elegant, almost aggressive simplicity. Stroganina is raw frozen fish, shaved into thin curling strips and eaten immediately, while still frozen, dipped if desired into a mixture of salt and pepper. That is it. That is the entire preparation. You take a frozen fish, typically a whitefish species from the Lena River system, often Nelma or Muksun or Chur, species that live in the clean, cold, oxygen-rich waters of the Yakutia river system and accumulate the fat reserves necessary for their own cold water survival. And you hold it by the tail and you draw a sharp knife along its length in long, controlled strokes, producing thin, translucent, slightly curling shavings of frozen fish flesh that you eat directly from the blade or collect in a bowl and consume with fingers, quickly, before they begin to thaw. Because thawing, paradoxically, is the enemy of Stroganina's particular pleasure, the texture of the frozen shavings, the way they melt in the mouth rather than being chewed, the clean, cold, faintly sweet flavor of river fish at its absolute freshest. All of this depends on the fish remaining frozen until it reaches your tongue. There is a school of food writing that would have a great deal to say about Stroganina, about its minimalism, about the way it reduces the act of eating to its most essential components, about the philosophical statement implicit in a food tradition that does not cook, does not season beyond salt, does not transform the raw material beyond the act of freezing it, which the climate provides for free. This school of food writing is not wrong, but it perhaps slightly misses the practical point, which is that Stroganina is what it is because it works, because frozen raw fish in the Yakutian winter is safe, abundant, nutritious, calorie-dense, and requires no fuel to prepare at a time when fuel is precious. The cold that makes the landscape so difficult is also the refrigeration system and, in a sense, the cooking method. The environment is the kitchen. The fish themselves are caught through the ice, a practice that requires its own body of knowledge and its own set of specialized tools. Ice fishing in Yakutia is not the recreational pastime of a person sitting in a heated portable shelter with an auger and a thermos of hot chocolate, though that version also exists and is not to be disparaged. Traditional Yakutian ice fishing involves the drilling or cutting of holes through ice that may be a meter or more thick, the deployment of nets beneath the ice surface through a system of long poles and cordage, and the management of those nets in conditions where the water at the surface of the hole will begin to refreeze within minutes of exposure to the air. It is cold, skilled, physically demanding work, and the fish it produces, pulled from water that is just above freezing, killed instantly by exposure to the minus 50 degrees Celsius air, frozen solid within minutes of being landed, are as fresh as fish can possibly be, preserved from the moment of death by the same cold that makes catching them difficult. Meat is the other pillar of the Yakutian winter diet, and it is eaten in forms and preparations that reflect the same cold climate logic as Stroganina. Frozen raw meat, particularly horse meat and reindeer meat, is consumed in a dish that is the meat equivalent of Stroganina, shaved or sliced thin and eaten while still frozen. The fat content of Yakutian horse meat is considerably higher than that of most commercial horse meat from warmer climates, reflecting the same cold adaptation principle we discussed in relation to the Yakut horse itself, an animal that has been selected over centuries to accumulate and store fat efficiently, and that produces meat with a fat marbling so extensive that it provides significant caloric density proportion. At minus 71 degrees Celsius, calories are currency, and fat is the highest denomination note in the wallet. Cooked preparations exist, of course, and are important particularly for warming the body from inside during the coldest periods. The traditional sake preparation of meat in broth, slow-cooked in large pots over the fire, producing a rich, fatty liquid that is consumed both as a soup and as a warming drink, serves the double purpose of providing nutrition and raising core body temperature directly. A bowl of hot meat broth in minus 71 degrees Celsius conditions is not just food. It is thermoregulatory medicine, a direct delivery of warmth to the body's interior that complements the insulating work of the clothing outside. The sake drink broth the way other cultures drink tea, frequently, habitually, as a social and restorative act embedded throughout the day. Offal, the organs of slaughtered animals, is consumed in Yakutian tradition with none of the squeamishness that temperate world food culture has developed around it, and for good reason. Organs are among the most nutritionally dense parts of any animal, rich in vitamins and minerals that are otherwise difficult to obtain in a diet with minimal plant foods. The liver, kidneys, heart, and lungs of reindeer and horses are eaten fresh and warm immediately after slaughter. This is both a practical measure, since they are the most perishable parts of the animal and the least suited to long frozen storage, and a traditional one, since the sharing of fresh offal immediately after a successful hunt or slaughter carries social and ritual meaning in sake culture that goes beyond its nutritional significance. The blood is consumed as well, warm from the animal, either drunk directly or incorporated into blood sausage and other preparations. This is not barbarism. This is complete utilization of a resource that has been obtained at considerable effort in conditions of considerable difficulty, and it is an expression of a relationship with food that wastes nothing, values everything, and understands at a cellular level what the body needs. Dairy plays a role in the Saka diet in the form of products from their cattle and, seasonally, from mares. Kumis, fermented mare's milk, is primarily a warm-season product, produced and consumed during the summer months when the mares are lactating and the grasses are sufficient to support milk production, and it carries the cultural weight we touched on in relation to the Isiaq festival. But cow's milk products, butter, cream, a type of frozen cream dessert sometimes called koyer that consists of whipped frozen cream and berries from the summer harvest, provide additional fat calories in the diet and a sweetness that is all the more valued for being relatively rare. The berries themselves, cloudberries, crowberries, bog cranberries, gathered in enormous quantities during the brief but productive Yakutian summer and preserved by freezing, which again requires no technology beyond leaving them outside, provide vitamin C in a diet that might otherwise be deficient in it, resolving the nutritional puzzle that initially troubled researchers studying indigenous Arctic diets. How do people with essentially no fresh vegetables avoid scurvy? The answer, in Yakutia as in other Arctic regions, is partly berries, partly fresh organ meat, particularly liver, which contains significant vitamin C, and partly the consumption of raw animal products generally, since cooking destroys vitamin C and the raw preparations of stroganina and fresh offal preserve it. The act of eating in a Yakutian winter has a social architecture that reflects the conditions of its production. Food in extreme cold is communal by practical necessity. The effort required to hunt, fish, and process food in these conditions is beyond what individuals can sustain alone, and the products of that effort are distributed through networks of family and community obligation that serve as both ethical framework and social insurance. If a hunter returns with more than his family can eat before it spoils, the surplus goes to neighbors and extended family. If a family's stores run low before the end of winter, neighbors and extended family provide. This system of reciprocal redistribution, sometimes described by anthropologists as embedded economy, the integration of economic exchange into social relationship rather than its separation from it, is not unique to Yakutia, but it takes on particular intensity in conditions where the consequences of shortfall are as severe as they are here. The Saka concept of hospitality is inseparable from food. A visitor to any Saka home, regardless of the season, will be fed. This is not a custom. It is closer to a moral obligation, rooted in the practical understanding that in a landscape where a journey can become dangerous without warning, the ability to rely on hospitality at any settlement along the route could be the difference between survival and its alternative. You do not turn away a cold traveler. You feed them, you warm them, you ask questions later. This principle, repeated across enough generations and enough winter emergencies, has calcified into something that feels less like a rule and more like a basic fact about how the world works, the same way the cold itself feels less like weather and more like a basic fact. There is a quirky footnote to the history of Yakutian food that involves the mammoth inevitably, because in Yakutia the mammoth is always available as a footnote. Frozen mammoth meat, the flesh of animals that died tens of thousands of years ago and were preserved in the permafrost, has occasionally been consumed by both humans and dogs in Yakutia, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries when permafrost erosion exposed carcasses in remote areas. The accounts of these meals are variable in their enthusiasm. Some suggest the meat was tolerable if cooked thoroughly, others describe it as unpleasant in smell and texture, the product of decomposition processes that had begun slowly over millennia in the frozen tissue. Modern scientists who have examined well-preserved mammoth remains note that the muscle tissue, though ancient, retains its basic protein structure. Whether anyone in recorded history has actually enjoyed a meal of mammoth is perhaps the most niche open question in the history of food, and historians still argue about both the frequency and the palatability of these encounters. The dogs, by most accounts, were less particular. The fire is low now, and the pot of broth has been simmering for hours, and the smell that fills the cabin is ancient and specific. Fat and smoke and something deeper underneath, the smell of warmth being manufactured against a cold that is trying, patiently and without urgency, to reclaim everything the fire has worked to heat. You are full. You are warm in the particular, complete way that you can only be full and warm when you have eaten exactly what your body needed in conditions where your body knew precisely what it needed. Outside, the temperature has not changed. It does not change much in January. It simply persists and waits, and keeps its cold, patient, absolute counsel. Inside, the broth simmers. The fire breathes. The dog, near the hearth, does not stir. You are fed. You are safe. The cabin breathes. This is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor, it is a physical reality of traditional cold climate construction that takes a little time to understand, but that, once understood, reframes the entire relationship between shelter and environment in a way that is quietly profound. A well-built Yakutian dwelling does not simply sit in the cold, inert and defensive, like a box with insulation stuffed into its walls. It participates in the thermal negotiation between interior warmth and exterior cold, flexing and contracting with temperature changes, managing moisture and air movement through its structure in ways that are the product of centuries of observation and refinement. And it does all of this with such unobtrusiveness that the people living inside it are generally no more conscious of the process than you are conscious, right now, of your own lungs expanding and contracting in the dark. The traditional Saka dwelling, the Balagan, is the starting point for any understanding of how humans have architecturally addressed the problem of -71 degrees Celsius, and it is worth picturing with some care. The Balagan is a log structure, typically roughly rectangular in plan, with walls that lean slightly inward as they rise, a shape that reduces the surface area exposed to cold air and provides structural stability without requiring the complex joinery of vertical wall construction. The logs are notched and stacked horizontally in the manner of log cabin construction found across subarctic Eurasia and North America, a technique so universally effective in forested cold climates that it represents one of history's clearest examples of different cultures arriving at identical structural solutions through independent reasoning. The gaps between the logs are packed with moss, with dried grass, with animal hair, with clay, whatever is locally available and effective at stopping the infiltration of cold air, and the resulting wall has a thermal mass and an insulative quality that modern builders attempting to replicate it have found surprisingly competitive with contemporary insulated construction. The roof of the Balagan is low-pitched and heavy, covered with earth and sometimes with sod, a layer of living or dried vegetation over a bark and log substructure that provides both insulation and, in summer, some thermal mass to buffer temperature swings. A low roof is thermally advantageous in extreme cold for a reason that is easy to overlook: warm air rises, and in a tall room, the warm air produced by your fire rises to the ceiling and stays there, producing a warm layer above and a cold layer below, a stratification that means you are often breathing and working in air considerably cooler than the room's average temperature. A low ceiling keeps the warm air closer to the occupants, reduces the volume of air that must be heated, and minimizes the thermal losses through the roof surface. The Balagan's low-pitched roof is not a stylistic choice. It is a thermodynamic one. The floor of the Balagan is a matter of considerable practical importance, because the floor is the surface closest to the permafrost below, and permafrost, as you have learned, is cold in a way that is absolute and non-negotiable. Traditional Balagan floors are sometimes earthen, compacted and covered with hides or wooden planking, with a layer of insulating material between the floor surface and the ground below. The challenge is to insulate the floor from the permafrost without, here is the familiar tension again, warming the permafrost itself sufficiently to destabilize it. A floor that is too well insulated on the interior side may allow the ground below to warm, thaw, and lose its load-bearing integrity. A floor that is not well enough insulated allows cold to radiate upward from the permafrost through the floor surface into the living space, chilling the air at the level where people sleep and work. The traditional solution threads this needle with a combination of material choices and habitual practice. Thick hides on the floor, sleeping platforms raised slightly above floor level, the fire positioned to circulate warm air through the space without creating hotspots directly above the permafrost below. The fire itself, the hearth, is the physical and symbolic center of the Balagan, and it is managed with an attention and skill that reflects its absolute centrality to survival. The word management is not too strong. Fire in a Yakutian winter is not simply lit and left. It is tended, adjusted, read, and interpreted in the same way that a navigator reads the sea or a hunter reads the snow. The rate of fuel consumption, the color and character of the flame, the behavior of smoke, the distribution of heat through the space. All of these are information, and the person responsible for the fire reads this information continuously and responds to it. Too much heat, sustained over too long, and the structure around the fire risks drying out and cracking, or the permafrost below risks destabilizing. Too little, and the interior temperature drops below the threshold of comfort and eventually of safety. The fire must be just right, and keeping it just right is skilled work that is learned over years and is never entirely routine. The fuel for the fire is timber from the taiga, the great boreal forest that covers much of Yakutia in a dense, dark blanket of larch and pine and spruce. Larch is the dominant tree species in much of Yakutia, and it has the distinction of being one of the very few deciduous conifers in the world, a conifer that drops its needles in autumn, unlike the evergreen spruces and pines that dominate other boreal forests. This deciduous strategy is itself a cold adaptation, reducing water loss through transpiration during the period of extreme cold when the frozen ground makes water absorption from roots impossible, and it gives the Yakushan taiga a particular winter appearance. Bare larch trunks and branches without needles, standing in dense ranks that look from a distance less like a forest and more like a vast, skeletal crowd assembled at the edge of the snowfield, patient and leafless and waiting for the specific warm morning that will tell them it is time to try again. Larchwood burns hot and relatively slowly, and it is dense enough that a well-built fire of larch produces good coals, the long-burning, heat-retaining remnants of combustion that maintain warmth through the night when active tending is not possible. The collection of firewood in Yakutia is a serious seasonal enterprise, not a weekend recreational activity. The quantity of wood required to heat a dwelling through a Yakushan winter is enormous. Estimates for traditional dwellings suggest that several tons of firewood may be consumed in a single winter, and the collection, transport, cutting, and stacking of this wood is a substantial portion of the annual labor budget of any Yakushan household. The wood must be dry because green wood burns inefficiently and produces more smoke than heat. It must be accessible, because a woodpile buried under a meter of compacted snow in January is a theoretical resource rather than a practical one, and it must be sufficient, because running out of firewood in a Yakushan winter is not an inconvenience. It is an emergency that can become, with discouraging speed, a fatal one. The relationship between the balagan and the cold outside is managed through its openings, primarily a single, small door, typically oriented away from the prevailing wind, often with a small vestibule or porch structure in front of it that serves as an airlock, buffering the temperature difference between inside and outside and preventing the catastrophic inrush of cold air that a door opening directly into the heated interior would produce. Every time that door opens in deep winter, a quantity of cold air enters the dwelling and a quantity of warm air escapes, and while a single opening is a minor event, many openings over the course of a day represent a significant cumulative heat loss. The traditional Saka household therefore develops a rhythm of minimizing door openings during the coldest periods. Tasks that require going outside are batched together. The door is opened and closed as quickly as possible, and the vestibule is used as a staging area where outdoor clothing is donned before the outer door is opened, so that the transition from heated interior to frozen exterior is managed in stages rather than all at once. Windows in the traditional balagan are small and few, often made not of glass but of the stomach membrane of large animals, stretched thin and dried to a translucent, slightly amber-tinted material that admits some light while providing reasonable insulation. Glass windows, introduced through Russian contact and trade from the 17th century onward, are better at admitting light but worse at insulating, and early glass windows in Yakushan dwellings were a source of significant heat loss that required compensation elsewhere in the structure's thermal management. The move to double and eventually triple glazing in the Soviet era addressed this partially, but the fundamental tension between the human desire for natural light and the thermodynamic cost of having holes in an insulated wall has never been fully resolved in Yakushan architecture, and modern Yakutsk residents deal with it through window coverings, heavy curtains, and the resigned acceptance that their heating bills are higher than they would be in a more solidly walled room. The Soviet era brought its own architectural interventions to Yakutia, and they are worth a moment of consideration because they represent a fascinating collision between the universal logic of industrial-era Soviet construction and the very specific conditions of a permafrost landscape. The standard Soviet apartment block, the panel construction of the Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras, was designed for efficiency and rapid deployment across a vast country with highly variable climates, and it was not specifically designed for Yakutia. It was adapted for Yakutia with varying degrees of success through the application of additional insulation, modified heating systems, the pile foundations we discussed earlier, and the sheer determined persistence of Soviet construction brigades who were not going to let the laws of thermodynamics tell them what they could and could not build. Some of these adaptations worked extremely well. Others worked tolerably. A few failed in ways that have been generating engineering case studies and cautionary tales ever since. The most successful Soviet-era contribution to Yakutian residential construction was probably the district heating system, the centralized production of heat at large boiler plants, and its distribution through insulated above-ground pipes to connected buildings, which is a genuinely efficient approach to heating densely occupied urban areas in extreme cold, far more efficient than individual building-level heating in terms of fuel consumption and heat output per unit of occupied space. The system has its vulnerabilities, as any centralized infrastructure has, but its basic logic is sound, and the Yakutsk district heating network has kept the city's residents alive through winters that would be insurmountable without it. The quirky footnote to Yakutian construction history is the story of the ice buildings. Structures built entirely from blocks of river ice during particularly harsh winters, used as temporary storage facilities and occasionally as shelter, a practice that sounds paradoxical until you consider that ice, as an insulating material, is not without merit. Ice conducts heat less readily than stone, and an ice structure with sufficiently thick walls can maintain an interior temperature significantly above the ambient exterior temperature even without a heat source, simply because the thermal mass of the ice walls buffers temperature changes. The traditional peoples of the Arctic have known this since the invention of the igloo, and while the Saka did not develop a tradition of ice architecture comparable to the Inuit igloo, the occasional use of ice as a building material in Yakutia is documented and makes a certain thermodynamic sense that is easy to miss on first encounter. Historians still argue about the extent to which ice construction in Siberia was an independent tradition or a practice diffused through contact between different indigenous groups across the Arctic, and the argument, like so many others in the history of cold climate cultures, is ongoing. The modern cabin at Oymyakon, the specific, particular cabin that we have been circling around tonight, the one the dog has finally agreed to enter, is a hybrid of these traditions. It is a log structure, built in a manner that would be recognizable to a Balagan builder of 3 centuries ago, with walls that are thick enough to make a temperate world carpenter raise an eyebrow, with small, triple-glazed windows, with a door system that involves 2 distinct openings separated by an airlock vestibule, and with a wood-burning stove at its center that is the product of a century of Soviet-era metallurgy applied to the ancient problem of making fire do as much work as possible with as little fuel as possible. The stove is not the open hearth of the traditional Balagan. It is an enclosed, efficient combustion chamber with a long flue that extracts as much heat as possible from the combustion gases before releasing them to the outside air, a design that squeezes every available joule from each piece of larch it consumes. The stove is warm now, its iron sides radiating heat into the room with a steady, even generosity that is one of the most comforting sensory experiences available to a human being in a cold climate. That particular quality of warmth from a wood stove, which is a slightly different warmth from any other kind, drier than steam heating, more immediate than electric, carrying with it the faint, specific smell of hot metal and burning wood that no synthetic heating system has ever managed to replicate. You are sitting near it. The dog is near it. The broth pot, emptied now, sits to one side. The fire ticks and settles. The cabin is breathing around you, contracting slightly in the deep cold outside, the logs settling against each other, the structure adjusting by fractions of millimeters to the thermal stresses of a January night at the pole of cold. It is a sound you stop hearing after a while, because it becomes the background, the constant, the rhythm beneath everything else. The cold is outside. It is patient. It is always patient. The cabin breathes. You breathe with it. There is a particular quality to darkness at the pole of cold that is different from any other darkness you have encountered, and it takes a little time in the experiencing of it to understand why. It is not simply dark in the way that a room is dark when the lights are off, or dark in the way of a cloudy night in the countryside, or even dark in the way of a clear night far from city lights, though that last one is closer. The darkness of a Yakutian winter is a total environmental condition, Not just the absence of light, but the absence of the possibility of light, the absence of the daily rhythm of brightening and dimming that every human nervous system on Earth, regardless of latitude, uses as its primary temporal orientation signal. When the sun does not rise, and in the deepest part of the Yakutian winter, at the latitude of Oymyakon, the sun is below the horizon for the better part of 21 hours out of every 24, and what passes for daylight in its brief appearance is a smear of gray gold along the southern horizon that lasts perhaps an hour and never reaches sufficient angle or intensity to cast a proper shadow. The brain loses something it did not know it was relying on. It loses the feeling of time passing in the ordinary direction. This is not a poetic description. It is a neurological one. The human circadian rhythm, the roughly 24-hour biological clock that regulates sleep and wakefulness, hormone production, body temperature, digestion, mood, and cognitive performance, is entrained primarily by light exposure, specifically by the blue wavelength light of natural daylight that tells the brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus what time it is and instructs the pineal gland when to produce melatonin and when to stop. In Yakutian winter, this entrainment signal is dramatically weakened. The light that arrives during the brief solar appearances is low in intensity and low in the blue wavelengths that most effectively communicate time-of-day information to the circadian system. The result, for anyone spending extended time in these conditions, is a gradual decoupling of the internal clock from the external world. A drift, subtle at first and then increasingly significant, in which the sense of time becomes elastic, unreliable, prone to stretching and compressing in ways that are disorienting and sometimes deeply unsettling. The Saka people have lived with this for long enough that their cultural practices have, like their clothing and their buildings and their diet, been shaped around it. The winter rhythm of Saka traditional life is not the same as the summer rhythm. It is slower, more interior, more oriented around the long hours of indoor existence and the particular quality of social life that sustained indoor proximity over many months produces. The concept of waiting, not anxious, frustrated waiting, but the patient, purposeful waiting of people who understand that what they are waiting for will arrive in its own time, that the sun will return because it has always returned, that the darkness is temporary not in the immediate sense but in the geological and astronomical sense, is woven into Saka cultural orientation in a way that has no precise equivalent in cultures that have never experienced polar night. It is worth pausing on this point because it touches something that is easy to misread. The Yakutian winter is not a period of suspended life, of hibernation, of waiting for existence to resume. It is a season with its own full texture, its own activities and obligations and pleasures and social forms. The long nights are not empty. They are filled, in the traditional Saka world, with story, with craft, with the particular richness of human relationship that develops when a group of people spends extended time in close indoor proximity with nothing to do but be present with each other. The Saka oral tradition is one of the great oral literary traditions of the world, and it is a winter tradition, born in the long nights of the Balagan, developed and transmitted across generations in precisely the conditions we are describing tonight. The Elanco, the Saka heroic epic, a form of oral poetry that can run to tens of thousands of lines in its fullest versions, delivered by specialist performers called Olankosits in a combination of sung and spoken verse, is, in its spiritual and cultural DNA, a creation of the polar night. The Olankosut, seated near the fire, would begin in Elanco in the evening and might continue for several nights. The audience gathered around in the warm interior, the cold outside doing its patient work, the story unfolding in verses that describe the three-tiered Saka cosmos, the upper world of deities and sky spirits, the middle world of humans and nature, the lower world of darkness and malevolent forces, in language of considerable poetic sophistication, full of elaborate epithets, vivid sensory description, and the particular kind of narrative patience that oral traditions develop when they know the audience has nowhere else to be. UNESCO recognized the Elanco as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2005, which is the kind of institutional acknowledgement that tends to arrive slightly late to the party but is welcome nonetheless. The tradition had already survived the Soviet period, which regarded indigenous oral traditions with a mixture of anthropological interest and ideological suspicion, documenting them on one hand while discouraging their active transmission on the other, and had maintained its living practice in communities that kept it going not as folklore but as a functional cultural form, stories told because they were needed, not just because they were old. The themes of the Elanco are, viewed from a temperate world perspective, somewhat intense for bedtime listening. They involve cosmic battles between light and darkness, heroes who descend to the lower world and return, the negotiation of impossible tasks, the overcoming of elemental forces through cunning and courage, but in their original context, these are not frightening themes. They are, in the deepest sense, reassuring ones. The darkness that the Elanco hero descends into is the darkness outside the Balagan window. The lower world of the epic is recognizably the winter world, cold, without light, full of forces that threaten human warmth and human life. And the hero returns. The hero always returns. The sun comes back. The stories know this, and they tell it, winter after winter, in the firelit interior of the cabin, to children who are learning what the darkness means and what it does not mean. The children of Oymyakon grow up with a relationship to darkness and cold that is, inevitably, different from the relationship that children in warmer places develop. They learn early, not as an abstract lesson but as embodied, lived knowledge, that the cold is manageable, that the darkness ends, that the skills and knowledge of their community are sufficient to bridge the gap between the sun's departure and its return. The psychological resilience this produces is not simply a matter of habituation, of getting used to something unpleasant until it stops bothering you. It is something more active and more interesting, a genuine reorientation of what winter means, in which the long dark is not experienced as deprivation but as a different kind of season, with its own gifts, its own pleasures, and its own particular forms of richness. This is not to romanticize the experience, because the polar night does have real psychological costs, and the people who live through it are not immune to them. Seasonal affective disorder, the depression associated with reduced light exposure in winter, is documented in subarctic and Arctic populations, though its prevalence and severity vary considerably between individuals and between communities, and the protective factors of strong social connection, purposeful activity, and cultural frameworks that give meaning to the dark season appear to be genuinely significant. The Saka community's traditional winter social life, the gathering of extended family and neighbors in each other's homes, the shared meals, the storytelling, the craft work done in company, the games and competitions that structure the long evenings, is not merely pleasant. It is, in a real and measurable sense, a mental health strategy developed through centuries of living with conditions that would otherwise be isolating and demoralizing. The games are worth a brief pause, because they are distinctive and they reveal something about what winter indoor life requires of the people it contains. Traditional Saka winter games include forms of wrestling and strength competition that can be practiced indoors in relatively limited space. Grip contests, balance challenges, the kind of physical play that lets bodies that have been largely sedentary through a cold day expend some of the energy that has been building. There are also mental games, forms of strategy and memory that are well suited to firelit evenings when the hands are occupied with craft work and the mind needs engagement. The making of string figures, an elaborate tradition of cat's cradle-type constructions, some of which represent specific characters or scenes from the Elanco, is both a game and a kind of visual storytelling, a winter evening activity in which the patterns of twisted string become a parallel narrative language alongside the spoken epic. The relationship between boredom and survival in a Yakutian winter is one of those things that sounds almost flippant when stated directly but is, on reflection, genuinely important. Boredom, the state of understimulation, of having insufficient engagement for the mind's available capacity, is not simply unpleasant. In the specific conditions of a polar winter, where the temptation to go outside and do something is severely limited by the temperature, and where the indoor environment is by necessity small and familiar, boredom unmanaged can shade into something darker, into the restlessness and irritability and eventually the depression that extended confinement can produce in human beings whose nervous systems evolved for a world with more movement and more variety than a Yakutian January typically provides. The traditional Saka winter cultural program, the storytelling, the games, the craft work, the social visiting, the religious observances and seasonal ceremonies, is, among other things, a sophisticated boredom management system, developed precisely because the people who developed it understood, from long experience, what happened when it was absent. There is a document, recorded by a 19th century Russian ethnographer working in the Yakutian interior, that describes a family's winter evening routine in a Balagan, and it is worth the mental picture as you let your own evening deepen. The father is working with leather, preparing a harness component. The mother is sewing, adding a decorative border to a child's garment. The older children are playing a string figure game, quietly competitive about whose figure is more accurate. The youngest child is already asleep, tucked into the sleeping platform near the wall. The grandmother is telling a story, not an elanco in its full performance mode, but a smaller narrative, a family story, a story about a winter journey her own grandmother made, the kind of story that carries genealogical and geographical information embedded in its narrative without making a pedagogical production of it. The stove burns. The wind, outside, makes no sound at all in the still cold. The Balagan breathes. Everyone is inside. Everyone is accounted for. The ethnographer, writing his account later in warmth and at a considerable cultural distance from what he had observed, notes that the family seemed, despite what he describes as the primitive conditions of their dwelling and the severity of their circumstances, to be in a state that he can only call contentment. He finds this puzzling. He returns to it in his notes several times, clearly unable to fully account for it within the framework he has brought with him. The contentment is not resignation, he writes. It is something more active, something more achieved. He is right, and he almost understands it. The contentment is the product of a life that has been fully adapted to its conditions. A life in which the clothing fits the cold, the food feeds the need, the house manages the temperature, the stories fill the darkness, and the community provides what no individual could provide alone. There is no gap between what is required and what is provided. The adaptation is complete. And complete adaptation, wherever it occurs and whatever its conditions, produces a kind of peace that people living in more temperate but less coherently organized circumstances sometimes find themselves envying without quite being able to explain why. The night deepens. Outside, the temperature continues its patient, absolute maintenance of the record it has been holding for as long as anyone has been measuring. The stars are extraordinary. You know this without looking, because you have learned it already tonight, because the clear, dry, cold air above the Oymyakon Valley makes the stars sharp and bright and close in a way that the warmer, moister air of more temperate skies simply cannot match. Someone, in a Balagan somewhere in the valley, is telling a story. The Olankosut has found his rhythm, the long verses falling into pattern, the firelight shifting on the faces of the listeners, the cold outside making no complaint, the darkness outside making no demand. Inside, everything is sufficient. Inside, the story continues. Your own story, the one happening in your warm bed, in your warm room, at whatever local time you told us about in the comments, is also continuing softly at its own pace in its own direction. The darkness here is gentle. The darkness here is the kind that leads somewhere good. The cold does not announce itself when it comes to kill. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about hypothermia, the physiological process by which the human body loses heat faster than it can generate it, and which, at the temperatures available in a Yakutian January, can progress from first contact to fatal outcome in a time frame that would surprise most people who have not thought carefully about it. We have a cultural image of freezing to death that is dramatic, that involves struggle and desperation and a last heroic effort against an overwhelming force, and this image is wrong in almost every particular. The actual process of hypothermia at its advanced stages is quiet, and it is deceptive, and it is in some ways almost kind, in the way that certain very serious things are almost kind when you get close enough to them to see clearly how they work. You are going to learn about this tonight, gently and from a safe distance, because understanding how the cold kills is, in a very practical sense, understanding how the people of Yakutia have managed not to be killed by it, which is the more important and more interesting story. The body's first response to cold exposure is the one you are most familiar with: vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels in the skin and extremities, pulling warm blood away from the surface and concentrating it around the vital organs of the core. This is the body being intelligent. It is triaging its warmth, deciding that the heart and lungs and brain are worth protecting at the expense of the fingers and toes and the skin of the face, which can afford to be a little cold if that is what it takes to keep the core alive. You feel this as the familiar discomfort of cold hands and cold feet and a face that stings in the wind, unpleasant but manageable, and the body's correct response to a temporary cold stress that it expects to be able to resolve by returning to a warm environment. The problem begins when the cold stress is not temporary, or when the body's ability to generate heat through shivering and metabolic effort is overwhelmed by the rate of heat loss to the environment. At -71 degrees Celsius, The rate of heat loss from exposed skin is so rapid that the vasoconstriction response, which works tolerably well at, say, -10 degrees Celsius, cannot keep pace. The cold penetrates faster than the body can retreat from it. The core temperature begins to drop, and as it drops, the cascade begins. Shivering, the body's emergency heat generation mechanism, the rapid involuntary contraction of muscles that produces heat as a metabolic byproduct, begins early in the process and can be vigorous and effective for a while. But shivering is metabolically expensive, burning through glucose and glycogen reserves at a rate that cannot be sustained indefinitely, and in someone who is already cold and tired and perhaps undernourished, in someone who has been outside too long or whose clothing failed or who became wet, which accelerates heat loss dramatically, the shivering will eventually exhaust its fuel and stop. When shivering stops, the body has crossed a threshold. It is no longer fighting to maintain temperature. It is beginning to accept the decline. The core temperature of a healthy human at rest is approximately 37 degrees Celsius. At 35 degrees Celsius, only 2 degrees below normal, the first cognitive effects of hypothermia become apparent. Slowed thinking, difficulty with fine motor tasks, a subtle confusion that the affected person typically does not recognize in themselves. This is the deceptive phase, the phase that has contributed to many cold weather deaths that might otherwise have been avoided, because the person who most needs to make good decisions about seeking shelter and warmth is precisely the person whose decision-making capacity is being quietly eroded by the cold. You do not feel dramatically impaired at 35 degrees Celsius. You feel perhaps slightly off, slightly slow, slightly less certain about things than usual, and if you have been outside in the cold for a long time, you may attribute this to tiredness rather than to the temperature of your own blood declining toward a dangerous threshold. At 32 degrees Celsius core temperature, the symptoms are more pronounced. Significant confusion, loss of coordination, the beginning of the paradoxical behavior that hypothermia sometimes produces and that has puzzled researchers and rescue workers for decades. People in moderate to severe hypothermia sometimes begin to remove their clothing, a behavior called paradoxical undressing, which occurs in a significant percentage of hypothermia deaths and which is thought to result from a malfunction of the vasoconstriction mechanism, in which the blood vessels that have been constricted suddenly dilate again, flooding the skin with warm blood and producing an intense, overwhelming sensation of heat that the confused, impaired brain interprets as overheating. The person, in the grip of this sensation, removes their clothing to cool down, in an environment that is dozens of degrees below zero, and the consequences are swift. It is one of the more tragic physiological ironies in the catalog of ways the human body can fail, the sensation of warmth, delivered at precisely the wrong moment, interpreted in precisely the wrong way. There is also terminal burrowing, a behavior in which people in the final stages of severe hypothermia crawl into small, enclosed spaces, behind furniture or into cupboards or under beds, a behavior so consistent across hypothermia cases in different environments and different populations that it is clearly a neurological phenomenon rather than a random one. The leading theory is that it represents the activation of an ancient brain circuit, the same circuit that drives hibernating animals to seek enclosed, sheltered spaces before metabolic shutdown, a vestigial instinct that surfaces when the human brain is cold enough and impaired enough that the more recently evolved layers of cognition have ceased to function effectively, and something older and more automatic takes temporary control. It is the brain, in its extremity, trying to do the right thing with the tools it still has available. Historians still argue about the evolutionary origins of this behavior and whether it represents a genuinely adaptive response in ancestral human populations or a non-adaptive byproduct of brain cooling. But the phenomenon itself is well documented and is now included in the training of search and rescue teams who look for hypothermia victims in enclosed spaces they might not otherwise think to check. Below 30 degrees Celsius core temperature, the heart becomes unstable, prone to arrhythmias, to the kind of irregular electrical activity that can cascade into cardiac arrest. Muscle rigidity increases. Breathing slows. Consciousness fades in a way that is, at this stage, genuinely peaceful. The brain, deprived of the warmth it needs to sustain full awareness, dims slowly, like a lamp on a fading battery, and the person enters a state of unconsciousness that is not painful and is not, in the immediate experience of it, frightening. It is at this stage that the extraordinary physiology of cold water drowning becomes relevant. And this is the quirky, counterintuitive tidbit of cold medicine that surprises almost everyone who encounters it for the first time. Victims recovered from cold water immersion with no heartbeat and a core temperature below 25 degrees Celsius. Victims who, by any ordinary definition, appear to be dead, have been successfully resuscitated with full neurological recovery. In cases where the cooling occurred rapidly enough to protect the brain from the oxygen deprivation that would otherwise cause irreversible damage. The cold, in these cases, has slowed the brain's metabolic rate so dramatically that it can survive without oxygen for periods that would be fatal in a warmer person. There is a phrase used in cold medicine emergency circles: "A person is not dead until they are warm and dead," that captures this phenomenon, and that has been the basis for resuscitation attempts that have, in documented cases, succeeded against odds that seem medically impossible. The Lazarus effect, as some emergency physicians have called it, is real. It is specifically cold-mediated, and it has saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. The people of Yakutia know all of this, not as medical doctrine, but as the practical accumulated knowledge of a community that has lived adjacent to these risks for many generations. The specific cultural knowledge about the signs of dangerous cold exposure, about how to recognize when someone is becoming impaired before they recognize it themselves, about the correct response to different degrees of cold injury. This knowledge is distributed through the community in the same way that knowledge about clothing and food and shelter is distributed. Embedded in practice and story and the specific advice of experienced people rather than written in manuals. The rule that you never go out alone in deep cold, that every journey in extreme temperatures involves at least two people so that each can monitor the other for the early, subtle signs of hypothermia that the affected person cannot reliably detect in themselves, is not a formal policy. It is simply what people do so universally and so habitually that articulating it as a rule feels almost redundant. The survival stories of Yakutia are not, for the most part, the dramatic rescue narratives that temperate world adventure culture tends to favor. The solo climber who survived impossible odds, the lone explorer who walked out of the wilderness by sheer force of will. They are, more characteristically, stories of community response, of the person who noticed that their neighbor had not come in from the yard and went to check, of the hunting partner who watched the other's face for the subtle grayness and confusion that signals the early stages of cold impairment, of the family whose older member knew the signs and acted before the younger member knew they were in trouble. The heroism of survival in Yakutia is largely the heroism of attention, of watching carefully, of knowing what to look for, of acting quickly and correctly on that knowledge. There are historical accounts, preserved in the records of Russian explorers and administrators who traveled through Yakutia in the 18th and 19th centuries, of cold-related deaths and near-deaths that illustrate the speed and deceptiveness of the danger in extreme temperatures. One account, from a Cossack expedition record of the early 18th century, describes a party of travelers caught in a temperature drop during a river crossing, several of whom became confused and disoriented before their companions recognized what was happening and forced them to a nearby settlement. The travelers who were recognized and treated quickly survived. One who wandered away from the group in the confusion of early hypothermia was found the following morning a short distance from the route, in the characteristic curled position of terminal hypothermia, having apparently burrowed partially under a low spruce branch in the final stage of consciousness. He was, by the account's description, peaceful in appearance. The cold had been, in the end, almost kind. The treatment of hypothermia in the Yakutian traditional context is, by the standards of its time and place, effective and well-reasoned. The victim is brought indoors and the wet or inadequately insulating clothing is removed, carefully, because in severe hypothermia the body is fragile, and rough handling can trigger the cardiac arrhythmias that are the most immediate life threat. The person is not placed directly in front of a hot fire, because rapid external rewarming of the periphery can cause a further drop in core temperature, as the cold blood that has been pooled in the constricted peripheral vessels is suddenly released back into the circulation, that can be enough to tip an unstable heart into arrest. Instead, the rewarming is gradual, the victim wrapped in furs and insulated materials, given warm fluids if conscious and able to swallow, kept still and calm while the body's own metabolic processes are supported back toward normal function. This approach, gradual, insulated, core-focused rewarming, is the approach that modern wilderness medicine recommends for field treatment of hypothermia, and the convergence of traditional soccer practice with contemporary medical guidance is not a coincidence. It is the same problem solved by the same logic arrived at by different routes. Frostbite, the localized freezing of tissue in the extremities, is a separate and more common cold injury in Yakutia conditions, and it has its own traditional management system. The folklore treatment of rubbing frostbitten tissue with snow, widespread in European cold weather tradition, is firmly rejected in Yakutian practice, because snow at -71 degrees Celsius is itself a source of further cold injury, and the rubbing damages the ice crystal-containing tissue in ways that worsen the outcome. The correct traditional response is gradual rewarming of the frostbitten part in warm, not hot, water or against warm skin, which is precisely what modern frostbite treatment protocols recommend. Again, the convergence is not coincidental. The people who have been dealing with frostbite in these temperatures for centuries have worked out, empirically, what works. The modern era has brought snowmobiles and satellite phones and helicopter evacuation to Yakutia, and these have changed the risk calculus of winter travel in ways that are mostly positive. A mechanical breakdown that would have been a potential death sentence 100 years ago is now a cold and inconvenient wait for rescue. But the snowmobile has also introduced new risks, because its speed and range allow people to travel further from shelter and community than the traditional dog sled or foot travel permitted. And its mechanical reliability creates a confidence in cold weather travel that the technology does not always justify. A snowmobile that stops in the middle of the taiga at -60 degrees Celsius is not a sled that can be run by dogs back to the nearest settlement. It is a large, useless piece of frozen metal, and the person standing next to it is now dependent on the same survival knowledge that the person standing in the same spot a century ago would have needed, knowledge that the modern world sometimes allows to atrophy. Historians still argue about whether the modernization of Arctic transport has, overall, increased or decreased cold weather mortality in Yakutia, and the answer is probably that it has decreased aggregate mortality while changing its character. Fewer deaths from exhaustion and exposure on long traditional journeys, more deaths from the specific failure modes of mechanical transport in extreme cold, failures that the traditional knowledge base is not specifically designed to address. The cabin is very warm now. The stove has been running for hours, and the interior temperature is somewhere that your body, wrapped in the furs and the blankets of your imagined Yakutian evening, finds not just acceptable but genuinely comfortable, the kind of warmth that settles into muscle and bone rather than just sitting at the skin surface. The cold outside, the -71 degrees Celsius that has been the steady, patient background of tonight's entire story, is present, as always, at the other side of the logs, at the other side of the insulation, at the other side of the small, triple-glazed windows, but it feels, in here, very far away. It is far away. You are inside. You are warm. You are attended to by the knowledge of everyone who has ever survived a Yakutian winter and passed on what they learned. The cold will not find you here. The light comes back slowly, the way good things often do. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but with a gradual, almost tentative brightening along the southern horizon that you might mistake, the first few times you see it, for a reflection off clouds or the aurora playing tricks at a low angle. It is not the aurora. The aurora has its own character. Its green and white and occasional red curtains of ionized atmosphere moving across the sky with a fluid, dancing quality that is beautiful and slightly unnerving, like something alive and enormous moving just beyond the range of full comprehension. The light that comes now, in the early morning of a January day in Oymyakon, is different. It is quieter. It is the specific pale gold of a sun that has been below the horizon for 21 hours and is now, with the particular effort of a celestial body that has no particular obligation to make things easy for you, beginning its brief daily arc across the southern sky. You have been awake for a little while before this light arrives. Not uncomfortably awake. Not the sharp, anxious wakefulness of a difficult night, but the gradual surfacing from sleep that happens when the body has rested enough and the mind begins, gently, to re-engage with the world around it. The cabin is still warm. The stove has burned down to coals overnight, as it always does, and someone, in the traditional household it would be the first person to wake, which in a Saka family of any functionality tends to be whoever is most attuned to the fire's rhythm. Whoever has developed the specific internal alarm that wakes them when the heat in the room has dropped to the threshold that requires attention, has already added wood and coaxed the coals back into flame. The cabin is warm. The cabin was always going to be warm. This is what the cabin does. The dog is at the door, not scratching or whining. The Yakutia Laika has more dignity than that, but simply present at the door, its thick tail moving once, twice, in a slow, composed wag that communicates readiness without urgency. It wants to go out. It has things to attend to. The morning is, by the dog's assessment, entirely manageable, regardless of the number on the thermometer, which has not warmed overnight and sits, as it so often does in January, in the range of -55 to -65 degrees Celsius at the valley floor where the cold air has pooled through the long, still night. The dog is not worried about this. The dog has been going out into Yakutian January mornings for the entirety of its lived experience, and its assessment of the situation is correct and well-calibrated and based on information. The smell of the air at the door's threshold, the particular quality of the cold that seeps under the gap at the bottom, the sound of the settlement outside, the absence of wind, that it processes faster and more reliably than you can process it from a thermometer reading. You open the door. Not fully, not immediately, you open it the way you have learned to open it, in stages, letting the vestibule take the first assault of cold air, stepping into that intermediate space and pulling the inner door closed behind you before opening the outer door to the full Yakutian morning. This is automatic now. This is habit so deeply ingrained that you do it without conscious thought, the way you catch something falling before you have decided to catch it. The cold in the vestibule is sharp but not brutal. The vestibule itself, unheated but enclosed, sits at perhaps -20 degrees Celsius, a temperature that would have seemed extreme anywhere else you have lived, but that functions here as a gentle decompression chamber between the warmth of the cabin and the full reality of outside. The outer door opens, and the morning arrives. The first thing you feel is the stillness. There is no wind. There almost never is wind at Oymyakon in the deep cold, because the atmospheric conditions that produce the extreme low temperatures are also conditions of high pressure and air stability, of the dense, settled cold that does not move because it has no reason to move. The air is absolutely still, and the cold and still air of this kind has that quality we discussed what feels like a long time ago tonight. Not the aggressive, biting cold of a windy winter day, but the total, even patient cold of air that is simply very, very far below the temperature of your body and will accept whatever heat you are willing to give it with complete and undemonstrative efficiency. Your breath rises in front of you in a plume of ice crystals that catches the first pale light from the southern horizon and glitters briefly before falling, silently, to join the snow at your feet. The whisper of stars, the locals call it, and you understand the name better now than you did at the beginning of the night, because you have spent the hours since then learning what this place knows, learning the vocabulary of its cold and its darkness and its survival, and the poetic name for frozen breath no longer seems whimsical. It seems accurate. It seems like the right word for the right thing in the right language. The dog is already 20 meters away, moving through the snow with a brisk, efficient trot, its paws finding purchase on the compacted surface with the ease of an animal that has never had to think about traction on ice. Pauses, turns briefly to look back at you. A check, a confirmation that you are still there, that the social contract is intact, and then continues about its morning business with the focused purposefulness of an animal that has a clear agenda and the physical resources to pursue it without complication. The settlement around you is beginning to wake. You can hear it before you can see it in the growing light. The sound of a door opening and closing somewhere behind you, the distant low rumble of an engine being started, the particular flat, carrying quality of voices in cold air. Two people talking somewhere nearby at what would be a normal conversational volume but which reaches you with unusual clarity because the cold, dense air transmits sound differently than the warmer air you grew up in. The voices are speaking Yakut or Russian, or the mixture of both that is the daily linguistic reality of modern Oymyakon. And you cannot hear the words but you can hear the tone, which is the tone of a morning being begun, of the day's first practical considerations being exchanged between people who have gotten through another night at the pole of cold and are now, with the calm efficiency of long practice, getting on with the next several hours. The light is growing. Not quickly. Nothing about light in a Yakutian winter happens quickly, but perceptibly, the pale gold along the southern horizon thickening and warming slightly, the sky above it shifting from the deep blue-black of full night toward a color that has no exact equivalent in the palette of temperate morning skies. It is the color of cold light on snow, which is a slightly different blue-white than any other light on any other surface, and it is the color of the brief Arctic day beginning its short, determined effort to illuminate a landscape that spends most of its winter hours in the comfortable dark. The cold at this hour is at its lowest point of the day, the minimum of the diurnal temperature cycle, the valley floor having radiated heat into the clear sky throughout the long night and reached the floor of what is possible given today's atmospheric conditions. In another hour or two, the sun will be at its highest, still barely above the southern horizon, still casting its long, raking, golden-blue winter light at an angle that produces shadows 10 times longer than the objects that cast them, and the temperature will have risen, fractionally, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees above the overnight minimum. This is the warmth of the Oymyakon day in January, 2 or 3 degrees above minus 65 degrees Celsius. You will not be removing your outer parka. The community of Oymyakon has been waking up to mornings like this one for as long as it has existed as a community, and the morning routine of the settlement reflects, in its structure and its sequence, everything you have learned tonight about how life is organized in extreme cold. The stoves are fed first. In every household, the first act of the waking day is the maintenance of the fire, the addition of fuel to the overnight coals, the confirmation that the warmth engine of the home is running properly before anything else is considered. Children are not gotten up until the cabin is warm enough for them to dress without discomfort. The heating of the room is the prerequisite for everything else, the foundational task on which the morning's other activities depend. This is such a basic and obvious priority in the Yakutian context that stating it feels almost redundant, but it represents a fundamental reorientation of morning routine from the temperate world version, in which warmth is assumed and breakfast or schedule is the first consideration. Animals are checked before breakfast in the traditional Saka morning: the horses, the cattle, the dogs, the reindeer and communities that keep them, because animals in extreme cold can develop problems overnight that require attention, and because the animals are, in the most practical sense, part of the household's survival infrastructure, their health as important to the family's well-being as the health of the stove or the integrity of the roof. The person who goes out to check the animals in the early morning of a Yakutian January is performing an act of care that is simultaneously personal and economic and existential, attending to creatures whose continued well-being is woven into their own. The school in Oymyakon has a temperature threshold, a point below which classes are canceled for the day because the cold is judged too severe for children to make the journey safely. This threshold varies by source and by the age of the students, but it is generally reported at around minus 52 degrees Celsius for the oldest students, with lower thresholds for younger children, reflecting the greater vulnerability of smaller bodies to rapid heat loss. On days when the temperature is below the threshold, the children stay home, which in the Yakutian winter context means they stay in the cabin near the stove, doing whatever indoor activity the day presents. This is not considered a hardship by the children of Oymyakon, or at least it is not considered a hardship of the kind that requires any particular remediation. It is simply a cold day. Cold days happen. You stay inside on cold days and do other things. There is a monument at the edge of Oymyakon. We mentioned it early in the evening, the stone marker that announces the pole of cold, and in the growing light of this January morning, it stands in the snow with a kind of cheerful, slightly absurd dignity, its inscription facing south toward the brief arc of the winter sun. Tourists have come to photograph it, increasingly in recent years, arriving after the long journey down the road of bones in vehicles with engine block heaters and wearing the best cold weather gear that outdoor retail can provide, and standing in front of the monument in the minus 50 degrees Celsius air for long enough to get the photograph and then retreating very quickly to the vehicle. The locals watch this with the affectionate, slightly resigned amusement of people whose home has become a destination for other people's adventure, their ordinary life reframed as an extreme experience by the perspective of visitors who find the cold genuinely shocking and the survival of a community in it genuinely remarkable. It is remarkable. That is the thing. The residents of Oymyakon are correct not to find it remarkable because from the inside, from the perspective of people who have grown up in this place and been shaped by it at every level, physiologically, culturally, linguistically, socially, it is simply life, the only life they know, the life for which they are equipped and within which they function. But from the outside, from the perspective of the rest of the world, the existence of a human community in this valley, maintaining itself through generations in temperatures that test the limits of what mammalian physiology can sustain, is one of the more extraordinary demonstrations of human adaptability available on the surface of this planet. The question of why people stay, the question we posed at the very beginning of tonight's journey, standing at the edge of the cold and looking in, has multiple answers, and they operate at different scales. At the largest scale, the answer is history. The Saka are here because their ancestors came here, because the chains of migration and displacement and adaptation that brought their predecessors to this valley forged connections between people and place that persist through generations, connections that are cultural and linguistic and spiritual and familial, and that do not dissolve simply because the landscape is difficult. Place is not just a location. It is a repository of everything that has happened in it, everyone who has lived in it, every story that has been told about it, every name that has been given to its features and its seasons and its animals and its particular qualities of light and cold. Oymyakon is full of all of that. It is saturated with it. The cold is part of it. At the smaller scale, the personal scale, the answers are the ones that people give when they are asked directly, which they increasingly are, as journalists and documentary makers and curious travelers arrive to ask why. And the answers are the ordinary ones that people give when they are asked why they live where they live. Because my family is here, because I know this place, because I cannot imagine being anywhere else, because the summer is extraordinary, because the community is mine, because the cold is manageable when you know what you are doing, because the stars are unlike anything else in the world, because this is home. Home. It is, in the end, always home. The most extreme place on Earth to maintain a permanent human community is home to the people who live there, in the same way that every place is home to the people who belong to it. Not despite its conditions but including them. The cold and the dark and the permafrost and the frozen fish and the wolf fur hood ruff and the dog that refuses to stay outside and the Olankosut's voice in the firelit cabin and the whisper of stars that frozen breath makes in January air. All of it home. The sun is up now in its low, determined way, casting its long shadows across the snow, illuminating the tilting buildings of the settlement in a light that is golden and cold and absolutely clear. The kind of light that exists only here, in this specific combination of latitude and season and atmospheric condition. The light of the pole of cold on a January morning when the temperature is minus 65 degrees Celsius and the sky is the color of deep space and every breath you take falls to the ground in crystals and the dog is trotting back toward the cabin with the satisfied air of a creature that has completed its morning assessment and found everything in order. You open the door. The vestibule receives you. The inner door opens to warmth, to the smell of the stove and the broth pot beginning its day's work and the particular smell of a cabin that has been lived in through a long, cold, full night. The dog pushes past you, circles twice in the way it always does, and lies down near the stove with its tail over its nose and its eyes already closing. It is not worried. It has done this before. It will do this again tomorrow, and the day after, and through all the January days remaining until the sun begins its slow, triumphant return to something like prominence in the sky and the temperature climbs, degree by reluctant degree, back toward the merely extremely cold. You have done this before too now. In your imagination, in the warm dark of wherever you are lying right now, you have spent a night at the pole of cold. You have dressed in reindeer hide and eaten frozen fish shaved thin and felt the whisper of stars rise from your breath in air that could freeze the courage out of almost anything. You have sat by a stove in a cabin that breathes with the frost and listened to the Olankosut's voice tell stories that the darkness asked for and the fire answered. You have watched the dog decide, with great dignity, that inside was preferable after all. You have learned what the cold knows, which is that everything endures if it is well enough made, well enough loved, well enough attended to. And now, very gently, it is time to let the cold go. Let it drift back across the 12 time zones and the frozen river plains and the bare larch forests and the starred, extraordinary sky, back to the valley where it lives and where the people who know it best are going about their morning with the calm efficiency of those who have made their peace with the most extreme ordinary life on earth. Let it go quietly, like frozen breath falling to snow, like the stove settling into its coals, like the dog closing its eyes in the warmth it chose. The story is done, and you are here, in your bed, in your room, in whatever corner of the world you told us about tonight. The temperature outside your window is almost certainly a great deal warmer than minus 71 degrees Celsius. You are surrounded by warmth that you did not have to work for tonight, warmth that arrived without ceremony, that required no reindeer, no larch wood, no careful management of a fire through the long hours of a polar night. Receive it gratefully. Let it settle into you the way warmth settles into cold-chilled muscle. slowly, evenly, reaching the places that had not realized they were waiting for it. Your breath is easy now. Your thoughts are quieter than they were. The images of the evening, the frost-sharp stars, the tilting buildings, the wolf fur ruff, the stroganina gleaming on the blade, the dog's tail over its nose, the Olankosut's voice falling into pattern in the firelit room. These images are softening at their edges, losing their precise outlines, becoming the looser, warmer shapes that thoughts take on as sleep approaches and the mind begins to release its hold on the specific and particular. The cold was always somewhere else tonight. You were always here, warm and attended to, receiving the story of a place that survives the unsurvivable with such completeness and such grace that survival stops being the right word for it. Living, that is the right word. The people of Oymyakon are not surviving the cold. They are living in it, fully and with great expertise and with the particular richness that comes from a life completely adapted to its conditions. A life in which nothing is wasted and everything is considered and the darkness always leads back to the light. Sleep is close now. You can feel it the way you feel warmth spreading from a stove. Gradually, from the edges inward, softening the boundaries of where you end and the night begins. The cabin breathes. The dog sleeps. The stars over Oymyakon are extraordinary, sharp and close and cold and beautiful, doing what stars do, which is shine without effort and without ceasing, indifferent to the temperature below them, indifferent to everything except their own ancient, patient luminosity. Let them shine. Let the cold keep its counsel. Let the story settle into you like snow, quietly, without weight, covering everything in a white and seamless calm. You are warm. You are safe. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. Good night.